Welcome everybody. This is New York Institute of Technology, and this is the School of Architecture and Design, the Master of Science in Architecture and Computational Technologies. I am Pablo Lorenzo Eiroa, I'm the director of the program, and today we're going to be discussing our final review of Architecture 701B, which is the computational design studio that I am also coordinating this semester. I welcome everybody. We are going to do a small brief introduction of our guest invited jurors for this final review. And then we're going to do a small presentation of the objectives of this studio. So I would like to first start, actually, I'm going to do a brief introduction of the studio, and then I'll introduce you so that we go directly into the projects. So the Architecture 701B is the first advanced design studio for the Master of Science in Architecture, Computational Technologies at New York Tech. The studio focuses on specific design questions, addressing them through a problem of representation in computational design. Students are asked to question architecture representation by implementing, displacing, advancing, and developing computer algorithms, activating, at least in the beginning, some notions of computer science. An informed realism becomes active once survey is understood as an act of design, activating also in parallel to computer science, data science. So the objective of this studio is to coordinate and criticize interesting relationship between computer science and data science. For instance, the latent conditions of sites, conventions, ideas of actual real spaces are surveyed, analyzed, expanded, critiqued, and displaced to activate relationship between explicit information flows and implicit virtual simulations. The studio problematizes media determinism by displacing computer science in relationship to data science, one of the objectives of artificial intelligence in terms of media determinism, but also the relationship between data science in terms of data flow and computer science in terms of weighting that data flow. Questioning representation parameters in architecture, students address how computation can be understood as proto-architectural. So in that sense, students are asked to think architecture through the architecture of systems and correlate systemics or the relationship between how one processes information and to think that as architecture per se. From big data gathering and processing to emergent computation through simulation to artificial intelligence, including data science, simulation, machine learning, artificial neural networks, and generative adversarial networks, to an augmented virtual reality simulations, students are asked to develop projects through computational thinking through specific cultural problems. The output of the studio, and this is actually dependent on the difference in the different projects, is to actually not only develop a project that is media specific and that is actually simulated through a virtual and augmented reality interface, but also to think about the development of an application of an app in relationship to the virtual simulation process that they are working on. And after this is a very generic brief presentation because each of the projects deals with these problems in very different ways. I let the students sort of develop their own thesis in relationship to this subject matter, and also in relationship to the surveys that they did. Some students work at the level of buildings, some students work at the level of urbanism. I did not actually, I let them do whatever they wanted to do. And also actually some students work more with historical heritage in their own countries, and others work in the area of New York City where we're located now in the United States. I would like to introduce a little bit more formally our guest speakers, not speakers, reviewers, sorry. I'm like, you know, with automatic pilot with the lectures and events, the reviews and presentations at NYIT. But thank you. Here we have Mario Carpo, historian, theoretician, and author of multiple books that we actually studied in our program. So thank you, Mario Carpo, for being here with us. Mario,
thank you.
you're currently at the Bartlett's in London, correct?
That's right.
Yes. So thank you for joining us. Hopefully it's not too late for you right now. So
no, it's very dark, but 4 p.m. in London is night. So
exactly. But thank you for joining us. And just as a brief comment, we have been trying in this program to correlate history and theories of technologies and computation in relationship to the studio and the seminars. So one of the things that the students did was to understand the evolution of computation in parallel to their projects. And that's why some projects did not actually make it all the way through in terms of contemporary technologies, but we're actually starting activating them. We also have Maider Llaguno Mutixnixa, sorry, the pronunciation is difficult, Basque, right? Basque last name, very difficult to pronounce. And Maider is a partner in the office, Maider Llaguno and Alejandro Sarapolo. So, and also Maider, now you're teaching in the Netherlands, correct?
In Belgium.
Belgium. So thank you for joining us.
Close to the Netherlands, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, a little bit off, just one neighbor country more.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you for joining us and thank you for being with us.
Pleasure.
Maider is also one of the reasons I wanted Maider to be here is that he's has been working a lot on scientific evidence-based design related to ecology. So that's one of the interesting expertise that we're trying to activate in our program as well. We also have Evangelos Pantazis. Evangelos is originally from Greece, but Evangelos is a known architect and engineer, crossing boundaries between computational technologies and advanced technical skills in relationship to architecture and fabrication. So Evangelos is currently teaching at California, right? You're teaching in California in San Diego, correct? Or no? What are you
I'm not
teaching
teaching currently.
Okay, you're not teaching. All right.
But thanks for the invitation.
Yes, and thank you for
Nice
joining
to see
us.
everyone.
Yes, and we also have Gustavo Alfonso Rincon. Gustavo is currently involved in many different programs and lecture series with Digital Futures, and we did a workshop in the summer and lecture discussion. So thank you, Gustavo, for being with us. Gustavo has a very interesting profile in the relation between cultural-based disciplines and media in relationship to computation. So thank you, Gustavo, for being with us. And we also have Nelson Montas that I didn't introduce before, and Sandra Manninger, who are also, Nelson is involved in teaching with us in the program, as well as Sandra Manninger. So thank you both for joining us. All right, so Salma, if you can start your project presentation.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining. I'll start sharing my screen.
We have to be a little bit patient, right? It's happening. Salma, you're not frozen, so. Let's try again. Usually it takes 2 times, right? So Zoom, bypassing Zoom hunger.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
So hello everyone, I'm presenting my project, which is the Museum of Pablo. So this project proposes correlations between the physical experience of the Guggenheim Museum in New York City, expanded through an augmented virtual reality platform that aims to expand on the idea of the infinite space. The new space is an infinite space of navigation and art discovery, retrieving inaccessible and stored archived paintings and works of art from multiple museums that correlate to the exhibited artwork. So the first part of the project consists of 3D scanning, acquiring real spaces, which are the Guggenheim Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, through photogrammetry and implementing big data processing. In this first part of the work, concepts of spatial infinity, continuity, and transcendence are portrayed using point cloud collection and representation to highlight existing spatial characteristics, as well as looking at them through a different lens, triggering new concepts and spatial typologies. So the point cloud is represented to reflect the different aspects of the spatial qualities and experiences inside of the building by representing the perspective view in both spaces and the experience of the spiral in the Guggenheim as a way of achieving spatial continuity and infinity, where the vanishing point is the dome as we go up the spiral. The point cloud is also used where we use the points as an index to represent and highlight the different tectonics of the project. The point cloud also represents the subject-object relationship as it reflects the experience inside both buildings, the Guggenheim being a deep space, a continuous space, and the Met as a layered picture plane space. The point cloud also gives this different possibilities of representation by applying swarm system forces on the point cloud and how far it can go until we don't recognize the building. We're also reflecting on the reality and realism of the spaces and the experience of taking the ramp by moving in a continuous space while traveling through the whole building, giving the impression that this space never ends, and the spiral as a gravitational force inside the museum. In the Met, there's also something very noticeable, which is the dialogue and the tension between the space of representation and the art itself, as we move from a space to the framed space to the frame to the painting. And I thought that there was a missed opportunity of putting the Panini painting Ancient Rome at the end of the stairs that lead to the European paintings, just to keep this dialogue of going and moving in the museum until we reach the Panini painting of his artwork inside of his own museum. This transcendence can also be felt in the Guggenheim, representing the building itself as an extension of Kandinsky's work. Here I'm representing the building as a manifestation of the artwork itself. The painting circles by Kandinsky by Frank Lloyd Wright and delicate tensions by Kandinsky by Frank Lloyd Wright. So the different aspects of endlessness, unlimited growth, transcendence between art, architecture, and space led to the idea of a spatial typology that helps attain a certain degree of spatial infinity, blurring the lines between both museums, between art and space, and between the physical and the virtual. So some intuitive distortions of the point cloud were made as a first step, mainly to extend the spiral and reimagine the Guggenheim as an infinite space that also reflects the spatial quality of the Met as different space pieces from around the world, artworks, columns, temples, architectural pieces merged into one building. And this distortion of both buildings combined with the spiral form, the infinite aspect of the Guggenheim, and the realism of the Met led to the reflections about a new space typology of the Museum of Babel, a third space that is not the Guggenheim, not the Met, that is both, but that is also neither at the same time. So before starting the project, the concept of infinity was explored through the readings of Borges, Library of Babel, the Book of Sand, and the Gardens of Forking Paths, where the author talks about the library as an infinite galleries of books, and the Book of Sand as an infinite book with no beginning nor an end, reducing at some point the library to a single book. So the Museum of Babel is a layered space where infinite combinations of paths, spaces, and painting collections collide to create a new space of experiencing and navigating art, where representation and space of representation are equally important to create an immersive experience, a new space of infinite galleries that exist at the same space, but at different times. So to create this infinite space, multiple layers of infinites are created inside of the building, paths, polymorphic spaces, and artwork. Before starting, it was important for me to study the typology of the Guggenheim spiral as a space, but also as a concept, studying the evolution of the idea before the building was built, and after that, how this space was also seen as a space of continuity and infinite experience, and how some ideas didn't make the final cut because of technical issues, such as imagining the museum as a bottom-down experience, having a fast or shortcut ramps, etc., and exploring the idea of Le Corbusier's museum of limited growth in the Guggenheim. So the conclusion of this study was to think about the spiral as a new space of eternal growth, experienced not only from bottom up or top down, but from multiple beginnings and ends, providing multiple experiences that are specific to the user at a certain time and space. The space of the new Museum of Babel is an individual experience where two people can be in the same spot, but experiencing different aspects and times of the space, an experience that differs from one person to the other and from one visit to the other. So the first layer that constructs the infinite aspect of the Museum of Babel is the paths. The Museum of Babel includes 8 thresholds distributed in the space, and the multiple permutations between these points create itineraries of the building. One itinerary is defined by the visit of all these points. All the possible orders of the visit that are around 300,000 possibility construct multiple versions of the space, as every path is activated and constructed when a person reaches a specific point, activating one version of the polymorphic space. The second layer is the polymorphic space itself. So another research was conducted to create a new spatial typology using mathematics and parametric variables to construct the polymorphic space of the spiral. So different attempts using parametric equations of the cone surface and the helicoid surface are used to code a new morphine form. The ramp becomes a morphine geometry using mathematical equations where parametrics are linked to the different itineraries of the paths, and each path between 2 thresholds activates one variation of the space, creating a space that keeps morphing and shifting while navigated. So these are the different possibilities of the polymorphic space. The third layer that is constructing the museum is the layer of artwork. So there is a multiple layers of hyperlinks that's displaying the artwork from different artists' periods of times and parts of the world that are arrayed inside of the building following the visitor's path. A data set of met collection using web scraping and API and social media scraping is collected to create multiple collections of artwork ranging from popular work to displayed to archived. And I went beyond that and beyond the artwork using machine learning to create generative art collections of the existing paintings to create another parallel virtual world of the data set. So here it's an example of Panini's work that is fed into the machine to generate a new look on the ancient Rome paintings. Another artwork to be displayed in the new space of the Museum of Babel is the point cloud of displayed spaces and architectural objects that we find in the Met or in other museums, using machine learning to and semantic segmentation to create a collection of artwork. So here I have the example of a collection of the history of columns and arches of the building that are arrayed inside of the spiral. And also having this possibility of generating new spaces inside of the spiral of historical buildings. Here I use the example of the castle of Vélez Blanco that is constructed inside of the spiral space. And keeping this dialogue between the painting and the displayed space, as the latter becomes the framing of the painting, or rather the extension of the painting on the space. Here, as I talked before about the framing of the ancient Rome during the point cloud collection, I used the idea of the entrance, the hallway, and the stairs in the Met. This space becomes the framing of the painting of ancient Rome, and the experience of navigating through the space to reach the painting creates this dialogue between the space of representation and the representation itself. So this whole architectural space becomes the framing of the painting that we see at the end of it. Another version of the spiral is having all of these pieces together: temples, historical columns, galleries, whether from the Met or other museums, to create the Tower of Babel inside of the Guggenheim, navigating the space, but also navigating through time and through different parts of the world. So the Museum of Babel is a space that is constructed while navigated through paths, polymorphic spaces, artwork collections, galleries from around the world, and virtual generated spaces of art and paintings, giving a unique perspective on art and space of representation. I invite you to look at the Miro board to see the final presentation as well as the process. And I will leave you with two videos, one showing a swarm simulation of the spiral as it changes while the space is navigated, and another one showing the navigation inside of the Guggenheim.
And Salma, you're missing the machine learning navigation of the painting, right?
Yes, I'll show that in the final navigation.
Maybe we can skip through it, or okay. Do you have any other video, or that's it? We cannot hear you. Do you have any other video? No, no, right?
Oh, I think that's it. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you, Salma. Thank you. If you want, just go through the images again and leave them running if you want while we have the conversation.
May I start by asking a question, since I just came, just to understand what's the spirit of the game and probably the remit task of the studio. So what we are going to see, they are all virtual spaces to be visited in virtual reality. Is this the general assignment, or this is a specific assignment of this one?
No, the studio, we asked the students to do their own data gathering with big data. So they went and they scanned whatever they wanted, urban spaces, buildings. But the idea is to come up with an app in which there would be a relationship between real and virtual. So there would be some in-physical intervention in some cases, or latent intervention that could be activated through the data gathering, recognition, displacement, and so on, and a virtual navigation experience project, right, as an app. So the relation between real and virtual through the app will actually be problematized, because some students actually anticipated that that transformation could have some physical impact, and some others, they left it at a virtual navigation interface project.
So in this case, the student, Salma, has chosen to scan some existing buildings, but just as a starting point of a project which is in fact an imaginary museum, a virtual space which exists in virtual reality and has to be visited with an immersive interface.
But the idea is to visit it physically, real time there in the Guggenheim, and that you take different itineraries when you can, virtually, when you can physically.
So there is a physical doppelganger.
Yes.
In this case.
And on top of that, there is the possibility of finding latent ideas that Frank Lloyd Wright did not build, and actually to think that that could be possible to physically have some connections that Frank Lloyd Wright did not develop, such as the shortcuts between the different levels. There is a ramp that Frank Lloyd Wright did not build that could actually be built.
Yeah,
but it's not the final
result is a virtual space to be visited via an immersive interface.
Yes.
Even though by visiting it, you will realize, oh, that's inspired by a merger of the Guggenheim and of the Met. But this is in fact the project of a digital museum.
Yes.
Got it. Now, just to understand, this is the general spirit of the studio.
Somehow, because in some other projects, they left it at the survey level, activating some issues about survey, and some others they are proposing a virtual interface, and some others are actually finding a way to intervene, because we're following a little bit Google's what I call the architecture of information, which is that by mediating information flows, you can actually activate a real architecture. So in some projects, we have actually the idea of the feedback as a way to actually transform physically the city or physically a space, if the application will be successful, let's say, because people would use it differently, right?
Got it. But this one is this one is a virtual museum.
Yes.
So it is an exercise on the huge topic of museums in digital space. Museums out of a meaning collection, storage, and display of physical or digitized artifacts which are meant to be seen primarily through a non-spatial experience.
Yeah.
If nobody knows what the digital museum is going to be, so
exactly.
Congratulations for tackling this colossal issue. Now, all museums have been digital for the last 20 months. So, but after 20 months, we are no wiser than we were 18 months ago. 18 months ago, the task of designing, as we would have said in the 90s, a museum in cyberspace seemed something which was science fiction, because the idea was raised in the 90s, and the consensus was it will never happen. Then, when museums had to shut down, museums had to reinvent themselves digitally. And so they found out that they can offer something to visitors who cannot go into a physical building. But the idea that some art can be despatialized and distributed outside of building is an old one. André Malraux invented the imaginary museum. I think it was in the 50s. It was a collection of photographs. And the idea was that a collection of photographs which is printed and people can buy them and they keep books and everyone can have a museum at home. And it happened because with color photography in the 60s and 70s and 80s, every middle-class family around the world had at home a collection of museums they could visit by just opening the pages of a book. That was the bibliospace, the space of the book. And then in the 90s, we invented the idea of cyberspace, something you visit in virtual reality. And the idea was interesting, but it will never happen. In the last 18 months, it happened because we have nothing else. And so, but I haven't seen anyone coming up with a good idea of how creating a real virtual digital museum in cyberspace. Conceptually, we are not more advanced than we were 25 years ago. Even if now we have a technology which would make many dreams of the 90s become a viable reality. So I have no recipe in that, other than I suspect that trying to emulate in virtual reality in a virtual space, which can only be visited through an immersive interface, which is not the screen, which is going to be a virtual reality helmet. In that case, taking an inspiration from a physical space that you would visit by moving in brick and mortar, as we said in the 90s. I don't know, it is like taking something which exists in a pre-existing technology and transferring it onto a new technical platform by imitating something which we are used to and by reenacting it through new technological means. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is we do not visit a database with the same physical attitude with which we visited a memory place or an accumulation of memories in physical spaces. So we may have to come up with something which is unprecedented in the history of physical experience. Here, Salma evidently chosen the first option, meaning a museum is a building, we can transfigure it, we can transform it, we can reinterpret it digitally, but it is still the enactment in digital space of a physical space, which in this case, which we can even recognize as something we have seen in real life many times. That's one way to go. And then there is the other way to go, which is to say, we do not visit a database by disposing objects in the way that a traditional museum would have done, except that that's a post-human attitude, and I don't know how to even imagine it. So this is where I stop.
But I think Salma is trying to activate the three that you're mentioning, because the idea is to be physically there. And because of the struggle of accessing the archive, you know the problem they have in the Met, right? That they have like, I don't know how many times the archive of the Met is than what is actually being shown. And the problem is that even if they rotate the paintings, the access to the painting is not, cannot be ordered data-wise. So Salma's project is trying to make sense of also the problem that you have in a library, which is that the contingency or the relationship between one painting next to another painting that is physically makes sense, that's why one goes to the museum and you don't see it in the internet, right? Is the fact that you can experience the painting, such as problems of perspective, movement and so on. I think that the question here is both the physical experience of the museum in relationship to the data set and the ability to move physically and actually through hyperlinks be able to retrieve the archive and experience the archive, and even do the machine learning of the archive as well, as you do the machine learning of the space. So it's much more complex than I think that we are, because also Salma work at many different levels, but I think that the problems are more intertwined.
Yeah, it's not very clear because I think, we're living in a world of information technology, but information without context is meaningless as far as I'm concerned. So in many ways, the city or architecture can become a contextualization that could give meaning to information. And if we look at, let's say, painting or artwork as information, how do you create a context for that information? And if everything is digital, therefore everything is information, it becomes really interesting. How do you have maybe a self-referential context, as we have seen with a lot of news or fake news, which are on their own cycle of self-promotion and correlation. I'm wondering how you intend in your museum to become kind of a contextualization space or zone for the art piece, which I would consider as information in the information world.
Salma, you want to show the slides? Because what Fred just said, I think you're just showing one slide, but I think what Fred is saying, you're actually trying to address, right? If you can show the slide that maybe relates to that, which is a problem of the physical context versus the archiving context, non-context, right? But yes, Evangelos, go ahead, please. You have your hand raised.
If I may interject, first of all, thanks, Salma, for the nice presentation. I don't know how long did it take to develop it, but I think the problem is, as you named it, it's quite, the topic seems quite vast, as Mario also outlined. So it has to do from scanning the space, in my understanding, and that's what would be my reflection to it. Scanning the space, understanding all the spatial qualities with that, trying to form that into some virtual space, and then also trying to create some sort of automated navigation, if I got it, through that space. So I would say that's like pretty a long span of things to cover, which could be like, and then depending on where we would like to take it from, we can see it from different perspectives. So it's nice to get excited, and as to Frederick's point, excited with technology, but what are you trying to achieve with that? Like, what is the extra quality? That's a question that I had for Salma, that you're bringing in the space that is not in the Guggenheim or in the Met, beyond the fact that you can navigate there, from an interface from your computer. So what is the added special quality that we're getting from this combination of point clouds? Where are we trying to get?
So the idea behind the project was mainly inspired by this idea of unlimited growth that has been used in many architects' work, mainly Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier. And physically, it's impossible to think about a space that is growing forever. So I was trying to make that possible through this project. And the idea of the spiral is already the beginning of creating infinity. Like where we go to the Guggenheim and we're moving in the spiral, we're moving vertically, but we're also like, we find ourselves in the end of the space. It's this seamless transition between all these spaces, creating continuity. And I was very interested by this aspect that I wanted to expand on that, and thinking, what if this spiral never actually ends? And so with that comes...
we could see that, no? Like in your videos or in your presentation, there is all, it's finite. I always see the edge of the space that you created. It's the edge of the point cloud. Like you could make that, if you would make that seem infinite, which you could potentially, then yeah, I would go with your point. So think about that. Whatever you showed, there is a point cloud within the infinite space, a black space, which is not the case with Guggenheim. Guggenheim has a context. How would you recontextualize your museum in that virtual space? Because now there is no context in my understanding. And how would you make it look infinite, as if it was infinite? Like it gives, like Frank Lloyd Wright's building is infinite if you start dreaming. Like if I go in there and I can see the spiral going, you could develop that idea in your virtual world. So that would be something to think about. Like how would you make that look, represent that in the space that you designed? That is like kind of trying to put your work forward, because like if you're thinking about infinity, yeah, both in Lloyd's example or in any physical building and in your model, there is a boundary.
But you see,
You are not
to me,
clearing that.
the interesting thing is actually, which I think that is actually literally happening in the combinatory logic on the one hand, but then you're asking to, which I also ask, what will happen if you literally extend the space spirally, right? So I think that there is a combination.
Exactly.
Yeah, there is a combinational logic that is infinite, because Salma is trying to retrieve the archiving, which could eventually contain, for instance, the immersive quality of each of the paintings, because Salma actually started exploring 250 frames of the same painting, which could also is infinite, right? And at the same time, the museum could actually virtually grow forever in terms of the archiving, which is, to me, the latent condition of the Met, right? The Met presents that bubble idea, right? That all the museum of the world or the histories of the world would actually be contained in one single space. That's their ambition, but they cannot actually physically do it. But we can actually literally do it through data scraping, archiving, and interrelationship within the archive.
Yeah, these possibilities, I think, are of potentially immense cultural value to the development of the institution of the museum, and are accessing, anywhere as long as we have good enough, internet bandwidth. I think the project is, it's poetic and very sensitive. It's intellectually and technically quite rigorous. You design beautiful space. I think the conversation is really exciting about the transformation of the institution. And although you start with this contrast between the neoclassical kind of discrete spaces of the ways that art is framed in a very static sense at the Met, and the diagram of the spiral as a kind of endless mathematical model of the Guggenheim. And I think you do some exceptional work to generate these quite beautiful architectural spaces. And I agree with the comments of potentially looking at the spaces you're designing as requiring further hyperlinks to be able to link one of those models to the next model to, in fact, generate a virtual endless space. And I kept thinking, both at your midterm and here, why is it painting, which is the kind of form of art, which requires a wall and a background? You generally don't look at the back of painting, you look at the front of a painting. It's generally two-dimensional, maybe it's textural, and has a sort of third-dimensional set of properties. But I think in a way, I keep thinking of the exhibition of the virtual Van Gogh here in New York, which is in a really normative boxy space, but through the virtual apparatus, you enter the paintings. And I think that there's, although this isn't the remit of the studio, but it's certainly that of your brief, is to discover new ways of establishing new relationships between architectural space, curation, and the objects of art. And in this sense, maybe it's more video art, or it's three-dimensional pieces that don't have this problem of the 2D and of the wall of the background so necessary. That if you're not going to do the virtual Van Gogh, where you enter the piece of art and it's atomized through scanning and becomes three-dimensional, then I think that the paintings are a little bit of a disappointment in a way that we're looking at the same kind of art in spaces that require these sort of backgrounds. And I think that undoes, maybe, it's the worst kind of art to be viewing in a space that really doesn't have walls. And I think that inventing a new way of understanding those pieces and to entering them to kind of further embed the kind of virtual experience into the project would not see these objects of art as so fixed and two-dimensional, but actually that they become really part of the spaces that you could be designing. Now, once again, this isn't so much part of the remit of the studio nor of your project. It's an absolute outcome of this discussion and of the great potential of this project. So,
but actually, Tom, that was the objective. The thing is that Salma is doing it with the architecture. I don't know if people are realizing, but the archiving of architecture of the Met is literally being deployed through machine learning through the architecture of the Guggenheim. So we chose, I mean, we were going to do that, but we ran out of time. The idea, I mean, it's actually not that difficult, technically speaking, to inanimate the paintings the way that the Van Gogh exhibition is doing it. But we chose the architecture side because we are architects and because they also did it. So to replicate what they already did was not so much of the objective of the studio, as you're saying. But I actually think that was one of the things about the machine learning part, that the painting could become animated, and then yes, you could do things in between. But I asked Salma to focus on the architecture archiving, the objects that are literally in the Met, framing the painting as part of that inanimate thing. But that's also possible, so, and I agree with you that showing them in static 2D representation is not that interesting, because you can make an immersive quality of the painting, given the media, right? The media specificity. That's what you're saying. So yes. I agree with you. Yeah.
Well, I guess it's my turn. So, hey, thank you, Salma, for your hard work. And I'm very honored to be here on this panel. Mario, I kept actually putting up your book, but it doesn't really come up. But thank you for the inspiration too. And again, Evangelos, thank you. Nice seeing you. Great event that you had this summer. I really enjoyed it. I would say this. There was a lot to since I was here for the midterm, I want to first say a lot of good work. So thank you, Salma. And I think a lot of respect there. I remember studios from 20 years ago, and we didn't even have the computational power to do, I don't know, a fraction of any of it, right? So I thank you that you're pushing the limit of technology. But then I think about how you contextualize those limits and how you prove where they are in relation to architecture. So what is the edge of architecture? What is the edge of science? What is the edge of these computational algorithms or this proposed speculative space that you're in? So I guess I missed a little bit of the kind of the setup. If you did it for a client, like the 5-minute Google pitch, like, you know, what are the precedents? What are the things that you're building on? What is innovative? Evangelos, he asked a really good question, like, what are you adding to these spaces? And there could have been a quick response. I'm adding first the technology, the algorithms, and the infrastructure, but this is my vision, and this is the X, Y, and Z that I'm adding to both architecture, technology, and the sciences, right? So I think those are the sharp things that I was missing. I actually was very thankful for Professor Carpo's summary of kind of the past and how we see the problematic of the museum and the virtualization versus the photograph media and now the digitization. So I think I would like to hear from you more about this vision, because in my background, if you do a big claim like this is new art, new space, new this, new that, then you have to prove it. So what is the proof? So of course you don't have to do that here. I'm just saying in future, language is extremely, extremely important, and big claims never make any big claims If you're an architect, the claim is the space. So I would just focus on that only. And what I could see is that you needed a team of 20 people to pull off what you needed to pull off. So I think that you did admirably. So I think as a student, I remember trying to do the team of a firm, and you can't. So what is the chunk that you want to relate? I think that for what my research has come in, like I'm a part of this virtualized facility. So you walk in there and you see this 360 immersion, you know, with 24 projectors and with computers. So you can actually become an eye and an agent moving into whatever infinite computational space you have. So that's how I'm looking at this project. So if it's a person within the museum, are you presupposing that they have a new Apple glasses or the old Google glasses or the headset, or if it's augmented reality? There's so many problems with each one of those technologies that's why they have teams and companies to solve them. But what I like, if you can summarize, is the architectural problem that you are solving. Infinity is a metaphor here. I think Evangelos and Pablo talked about the idea that it is possible, but how are you contextualizing that infinity? And what is novel about what you're doing? Architecturally novel. And also, thank you for the work. I'm not trying to be difficult. I just wanted to know, because I think there's a lot of intellectual power in this room. And I think it best serves everyone moving forward what your position is. Looking at this as an architect or future architect.
I mean, maybe Salma, you want to answer, because also I have the same question in relationship to just computationally speaking, the halting problem. Like if you would let this system automate, right, and create all the possible permutations in an evolutionary context, right, what would that happen? That was, to me, one of the objectives that we would like to try. And also in the next project, there's going to be something of that. What is the relationship between the possibility of having this being literally infinite in relationship to permutability and in relationship to real-time processing, right? Because you could develop a platform that actually does that. So I don't know, Salma, if you want to talk about some of the things that you tried, because you tried to do the permutability, right? But then there were the other ones, right? You also have, you know, Salma, by the way, is creating a segmenting machine learning mechanism to identify with a 3D scanning how to actually create the archiving of the Met itself as a space, right? So there is also that added value that is not related to the painting archiving, right? But it's a parallel condition. So I don't know, Salma, you want to answer Gustavo's?
Well, just one thing before you answer, you know, what I see the claim of this studio proposing for others around the world is we have a certain understanding and a view of information and architecture, that unification, and there's a speculative understanding. So if you're redefining a future architect that is existing now, then I'm just looking for what is your position and what you represent fundamentally in this new proposed profession.
I asked them the same. So I don't know, Salma, you want to say something? Because that's, to me, I always ask that question. Okay, what's your architectural idea? What is the architect of today for you, or the architect of the future, right? I have a position, but I want each of the students to explore that in their own project, right? And that's how you create your own ideology, right? So Salma is quiet. Usually it's not so quiet. He's tired. Salma is tired.
So just to answer your question, like the idea behind the project and something that I would really want to try to create is through this application of navigating in this space. I worked with the Met in relationship to the Guggenheim, but the idea is really to connect almost all museums around the world. And so when we go inside of the Guggenheim, we're not only retrieving art just from the Guggenheim itself or from the Met, but also while navigating this space, we can find ourselves in the gallery in the Louvre in Paris. And so really creating this accessibility of arts from all around the world and having it inside of the space, and creating our own version of the Tower of Babel, which is, as we know, of this tower where all the people around the world used to live all together, having all these pieces from around the world. So the project was in a way trying to replicate this and like having this really full access to the infinite forms of arts that are around the world in New York City or even like in other museums, and have them inside of the Guggenheim.
There is the other, yes.
Sorry, Salma. Sorry, Pablo. Salma, the one thing that I wrote down is for this one tagline. So if there's like Elon Musk came down to New York and he saw your studio, you'd say, I need, 100 million because I'm creating a whole new museum. So it's art accessibility from information as a human right. So I want every child in every corner of the planet to be exposed to the top art because it will give them longer life and health. So if you said that to Elon Musk and he goes, wow, I need a tax write-off of 100 million, I'm looking for that line. And I think that, of course, as a student, you don't have that confidence, right? But Pablo has that confidence.
But
I think he'd go up to Elon Musk and say that. For sure.
Well, actually, to me, we are trying to bypass these guys, right? Like, through blockchain, right? But in any case, that's
however you get the money,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. However, but the idea is that actually what I call the architecture of information actually works at that level, right? And to me, we have to also think about the larger ambition of the Met. The Met is a space environment, and it's a city within the city, right? And the crazy idea of the Met is actually to, if you think about its extension, right, it's actually to encase all the cities of the world relative to their museum pieces, right? If you really can read that, I spend every weekend in the Met as much as possible when it's cold, because it really works as a city within the city. And I think that Salma is understanding that through an information-based system, right? Like, how would that be possible? And then you have the Guggenheim that also has that idea of continuous growth, that Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright were competing to see who was doing the Infinite Museum, because they both understood that is, a modern ideal relative to archiving and a museum project. So I think in that sense, the idea of creating that through information system is latent in Salma. It's not resolved, but I think that is, I wish I was asking, related to your question, a real-time processing in which the navigation would actually expand the space real-time and will correlate the archiving of the physical space in relationship to the archiving of the paintings. And that can be done with both machine vision, real-time scanning, and archiving, right? Web scraping API.
One thing, Salma, I wanted to say is that I love books, and I love art, and I love architecture. So when I go into my library of, 90 to 100 boxes of books, right? I imagine pages and pictures in my head when I sit in my reading chair. And that to me is a wonderful virtual architecture. And it seems like what you're trying to do is, with this space, is try to come up with this infinite relationship of all these images as information through this computational tool. And I think that is right, that scope is so huge. And what Mario basically defined as, we don't see a good solution, or we were working with ideas from 25 years ago. The tools are not 25 years old and on the verge of new computational chips and quantum computing. It actually might be more possible than we think. So I think.
But also, what you're mentioning about the library is analog, and I agree with you, because why would you go to a physical museum? And that's what I think Salma is exploring. that is the virtual museum is not just what the Met is actually now. You can actually have the virtual museum of the Met, right? They have an interface. It's so bad because they don't have any vision on. It's just retrieving the archiving and creating a correlationship with the archiving. But what's we are trying to do with Salma is actually to correlate space, location of the painting in terms of curatorial terms, and the possibility of expanding the work of the author, because you're actually creating a machine learning of the archiving that is correlational, right? You can access all the paintings that the author did, all the similar paintings, because you can scan them and create a machine learning that identifies all the possibilities of the painting, and even think that the author of the painting is alive somehow, right? Because you are extending literally the painting and the space in relationship to each other. So to me, the archiving is not really an archive, it's a live archive in which you can retrieve things real time, and because of their physical relationship to each other, where they are in space, and how they can relate to an expanded kind of Wikipedia, right, that never ends, of relationships, you can have both spatial quality and navigation quality.
Pablo, one thing is for sure is there's so much studies when it comes to athletes, dancing, theater, and performance with computation, like they do point clouds of certain movements.
Yeah.
I don't know of any architect taking a lead on understanding how the different typologies and structural components and the language of architecture impact the actual body or the series of performers and memory. I don't know of any. Maybe you know, Mario knows, I don't know. But I think that's where my limitation, where I come intellectually as an architectural scholar and researcher, confronting the sciences. So I think that with Selma's project, she's confronting so much. And I think with the metaverse coming here, who knows if a client wants to implant some of this and put it somewhere. I don't know. But I can only congratulate Salma for this stimulating conversation. It is very forward thinking. So I think that's complementing both you and the studio brief.
I don't know if Maider, if you want to say anything, or.
Yeah, it's an unrelated comment, so I didn't want to interrupt the related but not directly related with the ongoing conversation. So first of all, congratulations, Salma. It's really impressive to see all the computational investigation and processes you've been navigating in such a short time. I understand it was a semester long, so that's really impressive. I have a question related to the initial phase of your work, the surveying phase. I'm fascinated by that phase myself, the understanding, and I understand also it's the philosophy of the studio, the study of, the site or the real site of project to a very high resolution. And therefore you are using LiDAR scanning or, photogrammetry, but point cloud data set to do so. And I got a little bit, I kept on thinking when you changed to the following step, because I didn't really see the impact of that initial, if you like, analytical process or exploratory process of a high resolution data set of two given spaces, in this case, the Guggenheim Museum and the Met, and how that translates into the virtual, no? So I'm wondering, with point cloud data, we can have, of course, very high-res geometrical information, also color information, light intensity information. We can also get into very concrete, specific environmental information that it would be very difficult to get from, regular drawings or 2D and 3D representations, So also tapping into what Pablo was saying about this kind of latent aspects that maybe they were not envisioning, right, wasn't envisioning back then, or also through the construction process, things that happen, that nothing is perfectly, orthogonal, or these kind of details and specificities of the project that we are since very recently able to quantify and to acknowledge, However, then you jump into the diagram directly, no? You do the point cloud, and then all of a sudden you jump to this kind of, you know, a spiral mathematical processes, and you don't really inherit, or you don't, you know, bring into this information, this very detailed information that could be brought into the project, no? Like different light intensities that could be specific to your paintings, also for the machine learning, right? That could be, or colors, or, you know, even geometrical, you know, changes, compressions. And so the question is whether this is something that you thought about, that you would be interested in exploring, or how did this really big jump happen? And I'm, you know, my question, it's focusing on that first steps. I'm going to stick to the surveying parts and the transition into the initial projects, you know, attempts. But I'm interested to know how did that process take place, and, you know, how you're thinking to evolve it, if you are.
Salma? Well, Salma actually was looking at that in the beginning. I don't know if, Salma, you want to show some of the, you're missing one animation with the point cloud, but I wanted, we ran out of time, literally, but that was one of the issues. How do you, instead of like prescribing, I think Maider's question relative to data science, which is what I'm trying to do for many years, is like, instead of prescribing what to do, that you let from the emerging conditions of data, let you guide the kind of transformation or the type of architecture or whatever emergent problem would that be. And we try, actually, Salma did it with the semantic segmentation, because things happen in the semantic segmentations that are, you know, obviously semantic segmentation, by the way, is something that I would like to discuss, because it's a problem in itself, right? We are identifying point clouds in relationship to conventions of architecture, right? A column is a column, a window is a window, and so on. And I'm, you know, with this, for instance, with these point clouds that you see here now in the screen, we're trying to actually address a different way of understanding segmentation in itself, relative to your questions, Maider. And that can happen relative to gradients of heat. It can happen in relationship to coloring, right? And that was one of, to me, the most abstract, if you want, search in the studio. What is the logic of, because RGB values XYZ, right? I've been working with 3D scanning since 2012, right? And 3D scanning in itself, the point in itself is meaningless, right? But we as architects were trying to assign semantic meaning, which to me, the machine learning part is actually extremely problematic. So we are using the neural net and we're using the training, but I was actually very critical of that part, but we ran out of time. But I wish, I think that that's happening here in these point clouds that are transformative and they have their own meaning, and they are not related to perhaps the latest machine learning part, which is assigning and projecting a meaning and a methodology in discrete terms, right? And that's, to me, the kind of research that I'm trying to open up, right? Like, what is the logic of XYZ RGB in relationship to data sets that are not, in which you don't work with semantic conventions. But they need to learn first what's going on, right? The convention, and then try to do something in relationship to that. And that's where we are now, right? But yes, okay. Any other comments? Otherwise, we go to the next project. We're running a little bit late, out of time. I actually enjoy the long, you know, I'm more, you know, in terms of the difference between Jung and Freud, I'm more, I like the extended version of criticism, but unfortunately, we have the real estate of time, and I don't want to abuse our reviewers. So thank you, Salma, for your presentation. And now we're going to look at Yousef.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments.
Share my screen.
Yes.
My name is Yousef Ismail. I'm an Egyptian architect and a graduate of the Arab Academy of Science and Technology in Alexandria, Egypt. So my project takes place in Cairo. I had the chance to do all the scannings in Cairo before coming here. And it's mainly a platform, a virtual platform that could be that could act as a safe haven for writers and for creators, because Egypt has a very big political problem with books and writing, and there's no freedom of speech or freedom of writing. So the virtual platform could actually work as a safe haven for the people to contribute, and without having names, without being tracked back or anything. And that could be done either freely by the writer or through machine learning, which I will be expanding on later on in the presentation. So the 3D scanning shown here has been done by photogrammetry. This is a sabil. A sabil is a combination of it's a charitable building, and it's a combination of a public water dispenser and a school or library. It's divided into two parts. The lower part is the water part, the water fountain dispenser, and the upper part is the library. This is the map of Cairo. The thick lines in the middle is the Nile River, the main artery of Cairo. And this is the Muazzez Street, the main street of Old Cairo. Actually, it's the heart of Old Cairo. It has been founded in 1969 by the Fatimid dynasty. And since then, it's been one of the main attractions of Cairo. Here, showing a few of the monuments on the Muazzez Street. And going back to the sabil concept, the unusual combination of the water and the education stems out of Islam, the principles of Islam. I have a few quotes here out of the Quran and of a hadith by Muhammad. Mainly the biggest thing you can do to get the highest deeds is either provide water to passersby or thirsty, actually animals as well, or provide education. Water, obviously, because of the nature of the Arab Peninsula and the area, and education because this is how nations strive and nations grow bigger. So people would actually combine the two things, like people who had the money back then, combine the two things into a single building to achieve the highest amount of good deed in a single monument, in a single building. Analyzing different sabils throughout Cairo, you can see here that the first one, it's not really, you can't really identify the sabil itself. It's a part of the mosque. Later on, it began to have some kind of articulation. Then taking a corner of a street, and then finally the sabil I'm working on has been a standalone structure that didn't have any other extensions. It wasn't a part of anything else. So pre-construction, this is the Muazzez Street. This is a pedestrian heat map. The pedestrians were spread out along the street without having a specific meeting point. This is 1969. The sabil was created in 1744. So it began acting as a main attraction point, whether as a water dispensary or the upper floor as an educational facility and a library. In 2012, the street has been flooded, the Muazzez, and it remained like this for almost 2 months. We didn't have the resources to get the water out. And then later on, now it's used as an extroverted point. Like this is a very well-known gathering point, even though the sabil itself is not accessible anymore and the water is not running anymore. So people just gather there because of how divergent the point is, which is going to be shown later on. Following that, in 2018, this is actually a very funny story. There has been illegal excavations of antiquities in Muazzez Street, and the two people were caught. After they were caught, the government found out that there is a whole city under the city. There has been crypts and basements running down running under Cairo from Al-Maiza Street all the way to the Citadel. This is almost half of Cairo. And because Egypt doesn't have the resources, the topic died within 5 or 6 months. So we don't have the resources to do actual scannings of the underground area of Cairo. So as I was saying, the Sabil here acts as a node of divergence. So coming this way, you could see that it's diverging into 2 points, 2 pathways. Even though if you're coming through one of the side streets, you would see it as a flat edge and a continuity to the rest of the street. Same happens here. This is our top view of the Sabil. Possibility of the point cloud seeing the buildings inside out. And this is my personal favorite. This is showing the 3 layers of the street together. The buildings on the right, the Sabil in the middle, and then the buildings on the left. So you can see all the architectural features, and these are all actually from different eras. Like the Sabil is from the Fatimid era. The buildings on the sides are much newer. They're from the Mamluki Bahari era. So it's showing different periods of the Islamic architecture, overlaying the features. One of the references I've been following up with is a short story by Luis Borges, which is basically a narrator describes the universe as a virtually infinite library made of a great number of hexagonal rooms with a huge number of books which contain every possibility of the combination of all the 25 symbols, the letters and the space and comma and dot. So this was an intuitive take to the story. Started deforming the Sabil to take the shape of the hexagon and then infinitely creating the galleries and the bookshelves. My next step was going back to the water and inspired by the flooding that happened in 2012 and by the crypts underground, which are non-discovered yet, that were used by the Fatimids. I started retrieving the land topography and simulating water flow to serve both as a connection and as a node to the newly initiated towers and libraries. Spreading out the towers upon the nodes, I started thinking about how to deform and how to have different layouts of the scan tower. So I've done that by decaying the points. So the further the water travels, the less we have points. So it's kind of washing off the points, which resulted in different densities of point clouds. I started then exploring with different algorithms. Cellular automata was one of them, and then started applying smoothing to try to achieve surface continuity, to have all the surfaces as a one single surface, all the different curves. Going back to Borges, that the library is infinite. My library is actually not infinite. It's all depending on the number of hits or number of scans, which I'm going to elaborate on later on when I show the virtual reality. But the process here was, I would take the point cloud, out of them apply algorithms, and then have the point cloud grow using the algorithms, and the amount of generations and the number of how high the tower is directly depends on how many scans and how many and the input of the users, how many hits I get and how many books are written. I then created the 26 different towers for the 26 nodes. These are a few examples of them. Going back to the underground crypts that has been discovered but hasn't been scanned yet, so we don't have really a solid idea about how they move and where they are underground. I started exploring the possibilities of having them or recreating them through the water flow. This shows how the point cloud turns into the water flow, and then the nodes of the towers, different towers, turning into points that will start creating the underground crypts. The underground crypts were created by the water flow, applying different algorithms and simulations to simulate erosions and depositions, and ultimately collecting the water at the bottom, creating the passageways under the towers. Further on, these are GPT-2 machine learning model that I've created to inform the library, which I'll still expand on in the virtual navigation. I think it'll be much clearer in the virtual navigation. I'll move on now to the game. This is the actual setting of the mice as it exists right now. This is the top floor that was used to be a library. These are all 3D scanned. And then I start interacting with the books. It identifies the books. If I want to scan a book, gives me 2 options. I can go get more information through Google Books. I can get more books from the author, related books, and so on. Or I can go to the real library. These are all the sizes of all the towers are automatically updating real time, depending on the number of hits and number of scans and input of the users. So this is the number of generations right now at this time, depending on the current number of hits of the application. As I was saying, you can contribute to the library, which is the whole concept of the virtual library. So if you go interact with the book, let's say I don't know, the pyramids are. The machine learning would automatically start processing the data you have just entered and make its own text. And this is going to be saved somewhere in the library in a book that you can later on retrieve, or some other user can later on retrieve without knowing who the writer is. So you can either do that or write your own text or own book and have it saved. You can also check out previous works of other authors. Or you can navigate underground through the crypts instead of teleporting from one tower to the other. And these are all books written by previous users. This is everything. please feel free to check the Miro board. It has more details and it has more images of the process, more detailed than the presentation. Thank you.
Pablo, you didn't choose easy topics for the studio, right? You decided for each assignment should be encyclopedic and
yes,
involve the entire world.
The theory of everything, library of Babel, and yes, I know. That's a kind of Latin American temptation that we have as opposed to, because the problem of scientific method was coming in the previous review about kind of focus things versus correlational problems. But yes, this is a lot to deal with.
The student who spoke earlier, her name Salma, and I apologize, I didn't really comment on her work because I was trying to understand the spirit of the studio, and so I couldn't congratulate for that. At the very least, as a start of the technical virtuosity, the amount of work done. This is the same here. But the topic there was the invention of a cyber physical museum or something hybrid, something in between. And here, if I understand correctly, it is the invention of a cyber physical library, because there are actual physical books, but they are searchable through a digital interface. And of course, the paradox of the operation is, as already mentioned in the former case, what happens when we carry over some cultural framework and some practices from a pre-existing technological environment onto a new technical platform, which we utilize to reenact a simulation of a technology which is no longer, and which is, for that very reason, probably obsolete and unnecessary. Libraries, or not just libraries, any accumulation of stuff, a warehouse, like an Amazon warehouse, for example. Well, that's an example of what classification are no longer, but a traditional library. We have to put books in certain places so we know where they are when we look for them. Classification. And so books are on shelves based on a system of classification, which is for us a way to understand the logic of the world, but it is also a practical necessity for us to find stuff. We put it in a certain place, we know where it is, so when we look for it, we don't have to scan every shelf one by one. We know that it is shelf B22 on the third. This is the way libraries have been organized forever, classification. Now, today we really don't need that anymore. And if I mean, librarians still study classification, and it is hard training, but I wouldn't want to be a librarian because this is a profession which doesn't exist anymore. Meaning physical books will keep existing, evidently, and good, and nobody will complain for that. But the way of storing them and retrieving them will change, because the new way of putting books somewhere in any place is that they have a radio frequency identification tag or something when they come in, and they are scanned, and so we don't need to sort them following a classification system, because we can search the entire archive computationally when we need them, and we shall find them without knowing where they are. This is the paradox of the Google model. Google searches, so we don't need to sort. So for the case of a library, we could, instead of putting books on a shelf, make a huge pile where books are left at random, and whenever you need a certain book, we put a pair of Google glasses on, and we say, hey, Google, at this point, generally, my telephone starts answering. Hopefully, it is not in this room. Where is that book? And Google will simply, if you wear the glasses, you will see the book you're looking for blinking red in your field of vision. So you will find it without knowing where it is. This is because the logic of computational databases is completely different from the logic we follow to organize the world. It's a new kind of science. We must sort because we cannot search. Computers don't have to sort because they are so good at searching. If this is the general technical shift, the idea of how we physically organize a library, knowing that it will be searchable without any need for it to be sorted, is a colossal problem. And meaning, Yousef, you did what you could, but nobody knows how to do that. It is the same as organizing a cyber physical museum where works of art are either fully digitized or digitizable or digitally born. And so they don't need to have a physical presence, a footprint somewhere, anywhere. So yeah, we are architects, so we have to evidently maintain a certain kind of activity in physical space. But the risk is that we keep physicalizing activities which are entirely despatialized. They don't need physical space anymore. And so this is the paradox of what we do. And don't ask me to tell you how we can get out of it, because I have no clue. So.
But, Mario, I'm very happy that you're raising that up, because that's the logic of the studio, to say whether there is an architecture in the system or where there is a futility in architecture or not, or how is the transformation of architecture relative to the lack or the disappearance and dissemination of architecture. And I think that Google is already answering to that, because there is a correlationship between how we navigate and use our cities in relationship to real-time feedback data. And that's, to me, the way that I'm trying to address that is a little bit anticipatory in terms of what the next Google would be. And I know that the students are not resolving it, and we are not able to, but that's I'm glad that you are addressing it the way that you are, because that's the objective in the studio. Whether it is any old canonical way of understanding what architecture is about space, and if there is any relevance for that or not, and the dissemination that of the logic of architecture that interfaces and data bring. Now, the other problem to that is multidimensional data. That multidimensional data is a problem that is both physical and virtual and organizational, which is that how you are able to organize multidimensional algorithms and multidimensional data set is a spatial navigation problem. And that's where I think that's what we're trying to activate as an issue. That, in other words, the Google search has a dimensional problem that is monodimensional relative to the text search, and that is creating cognitive problems in our understanding of complexity at an informational level. And at least the people that I follow, they're trying to create, that's why also blockchain, right? It's a very complex multidimensional data organizational problem in which computation is happening, and the necessity of increasing dimensions relative to XYZ and other dimensional problems becomes an issue. That you cannot really organize information in, for instance, Wikipedia, right? In Wikipedia kind of expanded hyperlink, right? That dimensional level is already limited.
Just a little footnote. Let's not forget that the computational power of searching is already being implemented for post-human activities. For example, this logic, which is beyond our understanding and of very little use, of no use to us, is already used to automate Amazon warehouses, which don't even have light because they are only populated by robots who know where to pick up stuff because they are automated. And the complexity of the navigational system that Google is embedding into the urban tissue, into the urban environment, is in fact prearranged not to facilitate our navigation in cities, but to sustain a network of self-driving vehicles, autonomous vehicles. It is not for us, it is for a post-human technical agent. So,
well, actually, we're actually working with a vehicle routing problem, which is a way of automating automation in relationship to path. And that was one of the issues. I mean, it's actually a mathematical model that some people are addressing, bypassing the mathematical model, because mathematically speaking, there was one discovery last year, 2019 actually, and now people are implementing it. All the algorithms are following that new mathematical model. But other than optimization, the question is, what happened to space or space search in the algorithm? Because you have multiple nodes and you need to resolve topologically and through optimization, how do you actually go and compute the routes, right, in terms of physical delivery space, right? So both for the packages, the distribution, and what you're saying, Carpo, which is Mario, to retrieve the package and automate within the warehouse. So the same thing that happens in the warehouse actually happens with the airplanes and the trucks. That's why, by the way, that's why everybody's kind of going crazy, the delivery people, because they have these targets that are impossible, that are automated, and they literally, they are killing themselves, because the more optimized it is, right? Obviously, with an automated system will actually work better, instead of like pushing people to do impossible tasks, right? Which is what you're talking about, that we are already in a post-human, and that's why the Amazon warehouse workers are actually suffering that transition. They are actually living it through their own bodies, because they are collapsing, literally, right? But those are the problems that we're dealing with. So I'm very happy. I mean, yeah, they're not resolved. And so what is the architecture of information in that sense? Do you work at the organizational level of the information only? Or is there an interface transition model in which we can actually do something meaningful in relationship to what's going on? Or architecture disappears altogether, right? So those are the questions, you know. Gustavo, you have a question? Or
Oh yeah. The conversation is fascinating. I mean, again, thank you, Professor Carpo. Again, you're contextualizing things that I could barely even see in my head. And Pablo, thank you for your response. I just wanted to also just compliment Yousef for doing a great job firstly, and to say that there has been a lot of evolution since the midterm. So I compliment you on that. But I want to, I guess, to say that in the previous conversation and contextualizing this project, if the idea is search, and there is different domains of understanding of search, there's the post-human and the human. At some level, I understand our research group is working with a material scientist who's working with terabytes of data at the material level, at the atomic level. And there's no way that they can run their supercomputer simulations of all this data without a proper way of searching that data. So one is, how do you search terabytes of data? How do humans even understand what that data is? And then how do you confirm if it's the right answer or not for a discovery? So the sciences are already looking at that problem, because you need a human in the loop. If we trust AI to do everything, then we trust them also to destroy bodies, very similar to what Pablo was basically saying. We're basically dissolving the human, the humanity out of whatever this human or post-human is. So other than that, I wanted to say that it seems as though you did very well in evolving the project when it comes to this physical understanding, to look at a book, and this cultural, let's say, evolution of the form. So before it was megacities, and now it seems as though that you've framed it in a way that, at least myself, as a visitor of this, let's say, dialogue, that I can see that there is an evolution. But the bigger problems that, you know, that your professor has posed and that Professor Carpo is bringing up are so existentially huge and basically societally pivotal in our evolution as a species. I would say this as an architect, and if this is where you're driving at, you don't want to be a computer scientist or a scientist, were you successful in how you framed your project and what you want someone to experience? So you use the word games. How does this relate in the ecosystem of games and search? Have you done your research on that? And then what is that edge?
Yousef?
I use the word game. Yeah, I have used the word game because it's easier to imagine, because if you're navigating in our terms in a virtual reality, that's usually referred to as a game. But it's actually, I've been thinking about it as I was saying earlier, as a safe haven for, like, I know this might sound weird, but books do get banned in Egypt. Like, I have friends that ask me to bring books from here when I go back because they can't get them in Egypt, and I actually have to worry about smuggling the book through the customs. It's a hassle. So this was my main drive, and then further reading and experimenting with the machine learning and everything, I found that, like, me myself, I'm not a very big reader, and I'm not a writer either. So finding out there's a possibility to have the computer through machine learning, through feeding so many books and so many pieces of text that can actually be classified. If I only feed it, let's say, sci-fi novels, it's going to create a sci-fi novel. It might not make complete sense at this point, but I know that eventually, we're in 2020, almost 2022, maybe in 2030 or something, it would go further, and that the books would actually, like, everything would make sense. But to me, it's very exciting that I could write 3-4 books in 2 minutes through the help of machine learning. As I'm not a very big, actually, I'm not a writer at all, or a very big fan of reading. And
So Yousef, I wanted to thank you for that contextualization. So then I want to push forward here. So when you use the words gaming, I think my post-PhD understanding is that I was disciplined for a decade to use words carefully and to use research carefully in how you're pushing the field forward, right? So I would say caution in the future, no big claims. But secondly, if you are making a big claim, it sounds like you're trying to socially hack what culturally is not acceptable or limiting in your world, your geographical framework, right? So my question maybe for the 2.0 of this or further is, are there hacking methods? Are there new hacking algorithms? Are there an AI that hacks each other so that there's an evolution beyond our understanding? And what your project is as an architect is to understand how to spatialize either the algorithm or the spatial understanding with our interface. So I guess since you're the future of the field, right? You're the future leader. What are you challenging in Professor Carpo's understanding of where we are in the world, or your professor right now? Is he actually behind the times, or is he so far in the future that you're still catching up to him? So I think, to me, that would be a great revelation from all this work. And I'm, again, very thankful to hear this higher level discussion.
You know, by the way, I love the conversation because I'm actually working on a new book that is going to publish next year. And the main subject is the relevance of architecture or not. And I think that one of the things that I've been writing about and I've been trying to figure out is how scientists think of architecture, how Google thinks of architecture. And I find it extremely conventional. And that's what I think that we can still operate. So for instance, when computer scientists develop software, their notion of space is extremely synthetic and actually extremely conventional relative to what we think space is. So I think that still there we have an agency. And the same happens with Google scientists, that they figure out how to move in the city. Their notion of space making and their notion of space navigation, they don't understand really topology. They talk about topology, but they don't really activate topology in terms of space. And I think that there we still have a lot to offer in the contemporary understanding. The other problem that I have is visualization, of course. The word visualization is the conventionalization that there is no agency in representation. And I think that that's where we still have a lot to do addressing media determinism. I think that scientists, they have no idea about what media determinism is, although they are all the time projecting media determinism to the world. And I think that still there I have a hope for art, humanities, and architecture, because I think that we can still expand the notions and the conventions, even in machine learning, right? When I talk about semantic segmentation, what a column is, it would not recognize Alberti's problematization between the column and the wall, right? A machine learning algorithm. It does, but it does it in a very stupid way, because I think that the programmers already are biased in terms of what they think a column is. It's a conventional column standing in front of nothing. So I think that still there, in terms of classification, regression, machine learning, we still have, I think, a big project of deconstruction to do. And I think it's still valid. Even in hyperdimensional representation, which is another interface that we're working with. How do you represent hyperdimensionality? How do you problematize the representation of multidimensional systems is something that I haven't seen anybody resolve. And that, at least that's what we're trying to work on. So, but yes.
Sorry, Pablo, one thing I wanted to say is that in my experience now for over a decade working with scientists, scientists think of architects like artists. We have no place in their domain.
I know.
We have no place in even conceptualizing space, because why would we? So I think that if we actually societally respected architecture like in the arts and had an equivalency in, let's say, budgets of research, then I think we would be equals.
That's what I'm.
But right now we're not equal research partners. Yes.
I'm aiming for, and that's why I became a tenured professor, with the hope that we can do something, not just to sit down and replicate what Mario. I'm very happy that you raised the issue of, are we applying older technologies to new problems? That's exactly what I'm trying to problematize. And I think it's very difficult both ways, at the scientific level, at the technological level, and at the cultural level. And we see it. We had a terrific lecture series. We saw it how we need to problematize classification in machine learning, right? From a cultural point of view, from the people that are developing the data repositories, how the data repositories are being tagged, right? And we learn a lot from that process, and that cannot come from a scientific point of view, from a technological point of view. It has to come from a cultural deconstruction of how technology is activating biases in terms of the tools that we're using.
I think your project raises really some super important issues about the access of knowledge, the way that it can be spatialized, let's not use the visualization word, and how potentially through a kind of physical, virtual, or the spatialization of this, whether it is physical or virtual, of how we permit not permissible knowledge. I think there's also the converse of all kinds of knowledge which maybe should be limited, the spread of hatred. I think your project ultimately deals with a kind of humanity of knowledge, the way that you describe at least your context. And I think in some ways this discretization of these towers and is more, to me, more interesting than the underground crypts or the plans that kind of perpetuate a paradigm of networks that everything should be connected. And I think within the context that you're describing intellectually, where some knowledge is, or most knowledge is permissible and some is not, I believe that these breaks or discrete instances that you're describing that rise out of the network, I mean, this is all sort of somewhat spatial, but also metaphorical. It reminds me that we use VPNs so that we can access certain information or fool the websites that we're accessing information where we are so that we'll have greater access. And in some ways, it's something I don't know very much about, the dark web or the deep web, where there are certain protocols for accessing information because of the nature of their illegality or extra legality. We have kind of portals and thresholds within which we have to go through to be able to get to what we want to either see, order, purchase, etc. And I think there's something quite subversive about the project. And maybe my main architectural point is that there's a shift in this project from the belief that all things are connected through a kind of network paradigm, a move away from that to, I don't even have the right words for it, where you would have certain degrees of extensive relationality and connection, but some bodies of knowledge would not be connected to others for the purpose of making it more accessible. Now, I don't know what the visual spatial paradigm of this is, and maybe it's understanding networks as not a seamless set of connections, but one with discrete thresholds and gateways within which we go through to be able to access more hidden areas of knowledge. And I don't have a spatial diagram to describe this, but it seems like this this field of the towers has some way of spatializing that what I would love to see is a diagram of the deep web, because I think it might be closer to the kind of paradigm of networks that you're looking for, one which has thresholds that you go through, rather than everything being connected, which is the belief that all knowledge is democratized and the internet is this great savior. We now know, of course, we know that that's not the case. The internet is as much a vehicle for the spreading of hatred and bias as it is democratization. So what we don't have is the kind of network paradigms to be able to adequately describe these sorts of conditions of more controlled access for the purpose of and ultimately for the goal of creating a better humanity.
But in that sense, Tom, I'm glad that you raised that up, because what we call topology, like we're trying to do spaces that are not normal, right? We're trying to displace space. We try to displace representation. That is literally happening in computation, data science, machine learning, right? One way to displace what you talk about, the interactivity and the nets, is of course blockchain, right? Blockchain is a solution to the problem that you're talking about, right? With whether there is a dark part of the web and how you deal with that, and what are the validation means to actually bypass information or actually let that information go through. And parallel to that, neural nets and GANs and artificial neural networks of different kinds are actually literally trying to do the same with data flow and computational weighting, right? So to me, the relationship between architecture and computation, the relation between architecture and data science, that's what I would like to see if we can expand some kind of knowledge and meaning. And I know that the problem is, the students are learning the technology, historically speaking, and they are learning to actually deconstruct their notions of architecture at the same time. And usually happens what Mario pointed out, right? That you are dealing with what technology with there is a mismatching based on topological terms of the relation between technology, right? And ideally, one would be able to correlate them. And that's what we're looking for. But in relationship to the internet, right? That's literally what's going on. And I think that we still can do a lot more in terms of that, because, for instance, there is the current discussion about Ethereum. Ethereum, they don't know if it is a computational system or not. The blockchain technology of Ethereum is being discussed as an emerging computational system. It's not only a way of bypassing authority and validating gates. It's also a computational distributed system. So in that sense, there is exactly what you're talking about. That's one of the discussions today. And how do you intervene as an architect knowing that, and how you expand space notion or whatever architecture is? Maybe architecture is not about space anymore.
Unfortunately, I have to leave you because I have tutorial starting 5 minutes ago. So that was fascinating. Congratulations to Pablo for the studio and to the students. And thank you all for the interesting, stimulating discussion. To be continued.
Yes, exactly. Forever.
Soon. I have to go. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Mario. Thank you for joining us. And yes, Evangelos and Nelson, we didn't hear much. Nelson had a question, and then we kept bypassing. And Evangelos,
I don't have a question. I would like to thank everyone, and especially the students. Props for the work. I will have to leave. So to jump to another meeting, I would just want to end with a question of a design nature, let's say, to Yousef, and kind of a way to reflect. Why would you, since you went, I really appreciated your contextualization of the project and the whole presentation. But one question that I had, which I always kind of like to pose, is you're proposing something so much out there, but then you're struggling so much to make it architecture. So you have some images where you're putting the books, and the books look like really books, although they are hyperlinks. So why would the book in the library, in the tower that you are doing, has to look like the physical book? And it's not a nicer way of seeing a hyperlink. So this is like, for me, that's more of a comment than a critique. Once you're taking a concept, you're trying to, take that concept, be consistent and coherent with it. And I would have loved to see that coherency more, because you had a nice way of blending the old and the new and how you want your space to perform, but that would be also something to think. Like, would you like to see in that library the book looking like a book, since it's not gonna be a physical book? To you.
Like I said, I'm not a very big fan of reading, but so many people I know are. So when I talk to them, when they talk about the Kindle or about any platform that they use that doesn't have the feeling of the book, they feel something is different. So having the actual look of the book inside the library, I think that would, at least sentimentally, would give the user, the reader, the feeling that, okay, this is an actual library. I'm not sure if I know this is too futuristic, but not even having a book, I think, would be even like pushing the edge. Like, you're gonna find something there that's gonna be a book.
But I think
I don't know.
Yes,
I think it's
I'm talking more about the presentation. It's still a representation. It's a representation of the book, and I'm questioning why the representation of the book in a virtual library has to look. Also, it could look like papyrus, for example. Whatever they played in Alexander.
Yeah, that does not. Yeah, I totally get the point. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So it's like a thinking question or a thinking exercise for you, let's say.
That's one of the problems that we dealt all the time, the metaphor, right? Like, you don't need to retrieve the metaphor in symbolic terms of the book. And even the feeling, Yousef, that you're talking about the feeling of the book, that can be different. It doesn't, Evangelos, I loved your question, because that's what we are trying to also deconstruct. The notion of library and the notion of book has to be different, even if people ask you to fill the paper and so on. In representational terms, you cannot just simply simulate that, right? It would be different.
Yes, and I don't know, then we can open a whole discourse how you could redefine that. But exactly. For, let's say, the kids of Yousef, a rendering of a library, of a non-library, might not be as familiar as a Kindle to read the book. So since you are designing that for the future, how do you visualize the book in the future? What do you want to do with the book in the future, etc.? So that would be, for me, kind of a way to provoke your way to approach the topic. And I will leave you to that note, and thanks a lot. I hope it was it helped you figure out a bit better your concepts or think about your concepts. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you
for the work.
Thank you, Evangelos. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Evangelos.
Thank you, Evangelos.
Nelson, you wanted to
I just one question to everybody, include everybody. And but before that, I want to congratulate all the students. The projects I saw are really, really, really thought-provoking. I think y'all could see that in the conversations that ensued, and that's a very good sign. I want to congratulate your progress. I mean, I just want to remind everybody that none of the students knew how to code 4 months ago, so that's really impressive.
Not even a grasshopper, right? So
yeah, nothing.
Started from scratch.
I remember I asked the questions for in the first class. Like nobody has ever. Well, what helped is that most of them have really, if not all, a really good understanding of math. So that gives you an edge into accessing all this stuff. So the question is, with the Matrix Resurrections.
It's so bad, by the way. It's so bad, no?
I haven't seen it, but just I want you to think about this. Don't answer it. Just think about it. Why does the guy that created the Matrix is called the architect?
Yeah.
Just that's a question I want to leave you with.
And why the red pill and the blue pill, and why everybody's taking, the right pill today, right? Nobody's interested in the Matrix anymore. That's the scary part. Everybody's interested in the guy that is the stake, right? And chooses the stake. Everybody became that. But we are not, actually. The people here are not that, I think. That's what I think distinguishes us.
Yeah, the stake guy is Cypher.
Exactly, Cypher, right?
Cypher.
Well, Nelson, one thing I wanted to say is that I'm very appreciative of these discussions, and I'm surprised that they haven't happened more in the other architectural studios that I've been a part of. So obviously there's groundbreaking discussion and work being seeded. And so I think that is the acknowledgement, but ultimately, I think I read something recently that architecture is really the creation of this narrative. We're mutually growing together, right? Unless we can be all encompassing and memorize every space, you experience it differently every single time. So, and I think at some level, the studio is working at those depths, right? That length, that expanse of, the biological limits, the conceptual limits, and the computational limits. So, and I think that, Yousef, one thing that's very clear is that you should be feel very fortunate, you and your cohort, to really think this through, because this is what pushes you to push the profession forward. So, and I'm not sure about the Matrix. I'm very open-minded about that, but it is trapped in its time. So, and a lot of what I understand in science fiction is that why don't they have architects other than the Tron, picture, have an architect conceptualizing pretty much everything, right? Because it is a story, but it's created as a two-dimensional, metaphor or series of images. One thing is for sure is that you guys are building the future. Like when I see this, I see a speculative design or world building aspect to it, and you're problematizing it with what the problems are for today. So I really, really enjoy it. And there's a whole literature for that as well. So anyway, I just wanted to thank you for that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Gustavo. I also like to thank I think that what Nelson you were talking about is the math part, but it's also the interest. All the students were very engaged all the way from the beginning, and they kind of trusted that we were doing something interesting. So in a way that I think helped a lot, even with the limited knowledge. And I think through the semester, we saw how well, and actually have a talent. I have to tell them, I told them many times, you have a talent for computation. It's not only that you're implementing a lot of technologies, you are actually understanding them pretty well. Even with all the criticism, we invited the best people in the world, here, right? Like we have the top brains, and they were critical of the problems that we're addressing and that's why I invited them. I don't like to have a jury in terms of like congratulating everybody and doing just things that are pleasant, right? So I appreciate the honesty of the reviewers and the engagement in terms of thinking about these issues live, and that's what I care the most. But Tom, you want to say something?
I would like to do exactly what you don't want us to, is to congratulate you, and especially to the students, for doing really a tremendous body of work, especially that there's kind of remote studio in this program and everybody is far away, or I believe that you are, some of you are. And this is really an excellent first final review in the program. You've all done a tremendous amount of work since midterm. It was really a great discussion that stimulated, which is largely a product of the high caliber work being done and presented today. So even though, well, I think we owe it to yourselves as students to as much be critical and to raise issues and to shape the conversation around what you bring up by your work, but to also congratulate you when the work is achieved. And I think it really is very much achieved, and you've had great success in the first studio. I look forward to how the four of you will progress through the next studios and courses of the Computational Technologies programs. I'm going to have to get going, so those are more
absolutely.
comments. Congratulations, everyone. Pablo, very nice to see you. Gustavo, Nelson, and all the other critics. All the best and happy holidays to everybody.
Thank you so much, Tom, for coming. Thank you, Gustavo. And yes, we finished, actually. We don't need to extend it anymore. So I think...
So Pablo, I just wanted to say one last thing. It seemed, you know, while Tom is here,
Tom, don't worry.
Bye, Tom. But I just wanted to say, what if what you're proposing is foundationally what we need right now in society, is to say that if we don't involve architects like artists and philosophers with these scientists, we're not going to solve our existential crises.
Exactly.
I mean, and I don't care about a new nuclear weapon or a rocket. I'm not gonna be living in Mars. So if we can take those dollars and actually to figure out why you can't speak to the top mathematician or the top, you know, statistician or research scientist to look at molecularly how we come together and survive poison, survive, you know, dirty air, dirty water, different nutritional impacts. I think that's, to me, the future of architecture. We're evolving to that level now. So maybe with your book, you can address how we can change this world with architects as part of that team of leadership to navigate our species survival.
I think in that sense, we need to elevate architecture to be at the level of what the modern movement tried to do, at the level of what the Renaissance tried to do, and I think we are far from it. And I don't know what's going on in the US academia, but nobody's dealing with this, right? Everybody's taking the other pill, right? I never remember the red or the blue, right? But
of course. But it takes professors like you and people that want to take that risk to make people believe in themselves again, instead of taking on whatever is currently fashionable. Because,
well, you know, but you mentioned the word fashion. I'm glad, because Sandra, we were discussing that with Sandra before, and Sandra raised the issue of aesthetics. And I think that the problem in the US is that, especially in the US, right? I think it's the discussion is very superficial based on aesthetics. And the bigger problem is that the aesthetics that everybody's talking about is a conventional aesthetics, as if we all have to agree on what is beautiful, which is even more disastrous from a cultural point of view. And at least what we're trying to do here, if we're talking about aesthetics, is as what you're saying, Gustavo, which is a problematization of aesthetics, because aesthetics are highly biased and highly conforming, right? And we need to move away from the marketing desire world of inducing those aesthetics, right? That is what basically media is doing today, right? Media is actually selling a desire, clearly. And I feel that architects are just fulfilling that desire, like eating the steak and saying how juicy and how good it is, instead of dealing with the problem of the matrix, which is, okay, where are we and why we're doing what we're doing, right? And that's the reason, by the way, I am very selective of the people that I invite to my reviews. Believe me, you are part of a kind of clan, right? That this conversation cannot happen anywhere, right? So
I think, Pablo, No, I just wanted to say thank you for the invitation. I want to thank all the students. I want to thank all the reviewers. I've learned so much. I've taken probably 8 pages of notes myself. So there's a lot of territory. So have a great new year, Gustavo, and holidays. And Pablo, let's keep the discussion talking.
Yeah, I mean, we have to figure out a way to expand research in our institutions to address that. I've been trying and I couldn't do it. I wish I would be in a place like that is value instead of being so concerned about following up the trends, right? And I think that's and I think that I have to thank my dean. Maria Pervelini has a vision that is different, and that's why we are here, right? To actually complete that vision that is what is the role of architecture today relative to emerging technologies, right? And I think that our group at NYIT is different from other schools in that sense.
Well, one thing, Pablo, you're familiar with The Art of War, right? So I think if you're not familiar with Sun Tzu and The Art of War, the one thing that I feel like I'm living through is something called death ground. Everything that I think, every action that I have, even where my feet are on the ground, it's life or death. And in a strange way, if you think about it, you can understand that in architecture, we design for better lives and for the betterment of humanity. I think others look at it as profit and as for the dehumanizing of a quality of life. If we choose to fight together, I really don't see how the other side wins, but we're never together. So I think what Pablo is doing is making a seed, and hopefully we can come together in the future very soon. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. Nelson, you want to do some final comments? But feel free to leave, Gustavo. It's just now we are completing the review. So
Nelson, let's watch The Matrix together.
Yeah, exactly. But the new Matrix is so disappointing because it's exactly a remake with a little bit of better graphics, but that's it. And Nelson, you're muted. You're muted. Bye, Gustavo. No, you're still muted. Your mic is not working, I think. Okay. Well, bye, Nelson. Thank you so much. So I stopped recording. Thank you, everybody, for an amazing review. And the students, they just stay a little bit. I want to thank all the students for taking what we ask you to do and to take it to the furthest extent. And congratulations, everybody. Great work. All right. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to proceed to introduce our guest jurors to this review. I'm going to start with Christian Pongratz. Christian, thank you for joining us. Christian is a professor at New York Tech School of Architecture and Design, and Christian is currently involved in a parallel program that is correlated to our program, which is the MS in Architecture, Health and Design. Christian teaches different studios and different courses and seminars, and Christian's expertise is actually on robotic fabrication and other issues such as computational design with different approaches to materials and materials behavior and material science. So thank you, Christian, for joining us.
Thank you.
I don't know.
Hello,
if you
everyone.
Want to say, yes, I don't know if you want to say anything else about yourself or what you're working on.
No, I'm interested, of course, always in how you run the program here, Pablo, and hoping that we can run in the future more parallel streams in terms of materials and materials health, or let's say impact actually on human health and environmental impact. I think that is certainly a more and more important issue as it relates to computational data.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the objective, is that we cross relationships. I think next semester we're going to work, we're going to start working more with materials and robotics. So I think that we're going to have more opportunities to cross there. So thank you for joining us. But we also have Director Marcella Signore. Marcella is the director of the MS in Architecture and Urban Design. And Marcella also has her own practice here in New York, and Marcella is also usually involved in our reviews. Is a common guest critic, so thank you, Marcella, for joining us. I don't know also if you want to say anything about yourself or the program that you're directing.
I also hope there will be some overlaps in relation to data, information data, etc. So we just have our review, and I think there will be definitely a ground for discussing this further in the next semesters.
Yeah, great.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. So thank you, Marcella. We also have Professor Tom Verebes. Tom was also not only always usually actually involved in our reviews, but also Tom was responsible for co-developing this program at our school. So thank you, Tom, for joining us. And we usually host the actual public events and lectures with Tom. So we did a series that somehow relates to both the MS in Architecture, Health and Design and the MS in Architecture, Computational Technologies, discussing several issues of computation, robotics, and actually health and equity in relationship to, for instance, our current environmental crisis. So thank you, Tom, for joining us. And you just recently had a very nice studio collaboration with Tsinghua University, so which had like very interesting projects. So thank you, Tom, for joining us. And I don't know if you want to say anything else in addition to this.
Not much, really. Thank you, Pablo, for the invitation. It's after working together to submit documents for approval internally and externally for this program, it's really a thrill to see the conclusion, or well, it will be a thrill to, in the next few hours to see the conclusion of this first semester studio. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And finally, but most importantly, we have Fred Levrat, who's an external guest reviewer here. I had the opportunity of knowing Fred for several years now. Fred collaborated in Peter Eisenman's studio, actually Christian Pongratz also, and Marcella also. So there is a common denominator and a lineage in terms of the influence of Peter Eisenman in terms of our studio. So, and also Fred teaches taught at Columbia University, Pratt Institute, and many institutions in New York, and is also a usual guest critic in our studio. So thank you, Fred, for joining us. You also have your own practice in New York, and you're also working at several levels of architecture and urbanism. So thank you for joining us. I don't know if you want to say anything else in relationship to what I just said.
No, thank you. I'm happy to be here and seeing, a very contemporary topic being addressed by students. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, also, Fred, you work in your studios, the relationship between the real and the virtual. So that's one of the reasons I wanted you to see what we're doing. So especially in terms of issues of representation and so on. So thank you for coming. All right, so now we're going to start with student Farah Jalil. Farah, just as an initial framing of the studio, as I was saying before, students were free to choose what aspect they were interested in surveying related to big data. We started with 3D scanning using different types of data acquisition processes, from surveying with our own tools to accessing information through open API repositories, retrievals, and actually developing our own repositories. So Farah, each student in that sense is very different, the way that they understood computational technologies and the relationship with data science. And they also have different levels in terms of how they understood that relationship and different levels of completeness in the project. So we're going to start with Farah. Farah, why don't you go ahead and start with your presentation. Thank you, everybody, and hope that we have a nice discussion and we address the issues that we are trying to activate.
Hello, I'll start sharing my screen. Hello, my name is Farah Jalil. The famous project of New York, the High Line, is a project where you experience the city above grade. In that lineage, my project's name is the Up Sky Down Line. I am exploring two-level grades, below grade and the above grade. The below grade is the subway lines, and the above is the grade of the Manhattan. There are two books that informs my design process: Form Follows Finance and Delirious New York. I'd like to quote from the excerpts. From Form Follows Finance, what I understand is the most conspicuous presence, extreme height has publicity value that equally benefits corporate or speculative owners. From this, I understand the present skyline that we see is derived from finance. From the book Delirious New York, I'd like to quote, "The elevator is the ultimate self-fulfilling prophecy. The further it goes up, the more undesirable the circumstances it leaves behind." What I understand is the people that move around the city, mostly underground through subway, mass transit, subway station, are disassociated with the skyline above it. So my project proposal, the iconographic skyline of New York is connected at the deepest level by the underground subway transportation system. This root structure of the skyline is representative of how public transportation morphology is disassociated with the structures that they serve. The skyline thus becomes a threshold space between the public and the private space. In my project, I'll explore the dichotomy of reconstructing the skyline and reimagining it as a democratic structure for the people. The planes of the structure and the three-dimensionality of the structures above it in relationship to the mobility of people around the city can be simulated into an accessible virtual space, which I aim to present as a visual critic of inequalities that exist in reality. I would like to explain this diagram. The red dots are the turnstile data of the subway stations, the sum of people moving around the city in the station, in the subway stations, and the elevator map, the elevators of the high-rise confirms that the subway stations are more in density along the high-rises. This diagram shows these are the subway stations, platforms, and the high-rises associated with the subway stations. This is the data gathered from high-rise density, elevator data. This again is the commuter density gathered from the turnstile data, the entry and exit data of each station. With the data collected, I tried to run a machine learning regression model. The turnstile data was my dependent data, and I wanted to find out if the density of people can influence or has a role in the density of high rises. So the linear regression could not predict. It's not a linear regression, but in some cases, if the density of people is above a certain value, as in the more the density of people, with a nonlinear regression model, I could find out there is a linear relationship. More the density of a certain density of people could inform the density of high rises. I collected highline model through photogrammetry of downtown and midtown. These are point clouds models that would inform my design. I would like to share. Okay. So in an aerial view, we could see movement of people around the city and underground. But the idea is the mobility of people the buildings are static and the people are moving. What if the movement of people could also inform the buildings? I would like to share the Miro board to show some of the drawings that helped me in the design process. Creating the data set of the buildings in 3D point cloud models allowed me to explore transformations of the buildings, the skyline, individual buildings, I also tried using 2D images of the facades of New York to see some agglomerations. And I also tried seeing how downtown can change if set in a landscape setting. How I could reason people's movement with the movement of the people, how people's movement can change the form of a city. Firstly, I'm trying to have so this is the reason why voxelation of the skyline is because if I'm trying to see people's different people using the application in real time, the resolution will be done by the voxelation. this is the idea model. Thank you.
So just one question, Farah, do you have because I think it's not clear, so you have the movement of the subway and the movement of the elevators. Do you have the cameras for those?
Oh, yes.
If you can explain that a little bit more clearly, what it is, because I think that you missed to explain the experience of the subway.
So underground, it's a view from the tunnel, is because from the tunnel, how you experience the skyline.
So you mean from the subway, right?
The subway.
So this is the form of the app, or what is it? How do you see that?
In form of a VR application,
okay.
But an interactive one where different people would be using at the same time, and thus the resolution of the skyline would be changing in accordance to the voxelation. So I'm using the voxelation to change the resolution. So at a particular time or a day, or then at a particular day or weekend or weekday, density of people in the turnstile data, according to turnstile data, is different. So the view would be, the experience of the skyline would be different.
Okay, and then you have the elevator, or you only have this one?
I have only this one.
So this would be experiencing the skyline of New York from a subway point of view, real time, right? Okay.
Maybe I have a follow-up question, since we're talking about systems here on mobility. So Farah, did you, so in the data sets that you started to analyze, you looked only at the subway in terms of as an underground system, or there is any on-ground system that start to talk about the relationship with density and mobility, cars, pedestrians, or other forms of mobility, or only you looked at the subway as an underground system?
I only looked into the subway because I found out, because in my opinion, what I think is it's the more it is disassociated with the skyline for a commuter in the subway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's my first sense of, just as a quick feedback and questions. And I think that has to be said pretty clearly, because in a way you are looking at one specific line that relates to mobility and density, which are the subway. And again, your project started really with, to me, with the narrative of reconciliation, begin to understand what's above and what's below in terms of redefining a new skyline based on points of density and points of mobility and movement. So I will start to question how you started to set up your narrative for the data that you start to look at the beginning. And it seems to me that, again, there is right now a pretty one-to-one relationship between two things. the skyline, so the height of the buildings, the vertical connections, which are the elevators, in relation to the mobility system that only look at the underground, look at the subway. So I think there is a very precise, not precise, but there is a very selective, I would say, type of data that you're looking at that relates to two things: nodes of concentration that related to the subway stop. In a way, if you look at the two-dimensional map of the city from ground, we really look at nodes, points of agglomeration of where the subway nodes are, and what happens in terms of connections underground. So my question to you is how the above ground system can start to begin to inform your narrative. Because I think when we look at density, again, in particular related to movement, related to mobility, there is also a very important aspect that it's also what's at ground. I'm not talking really above ground in terms of the skyscraper, but at the ground level. So I'm missing a little bit the relationship between all the other sets of data that relate to pedestrian flow, mobility flow that relates to cars perhaps, or buses or other form of mobility that could potentially inform a stronger narrative between the initial premise that you start to work with, which is density and mobility are redefining this new skyline.
Maybe
yeah.
just maybe you want Farah to show the last because it's missing one set, the set of the elevators, before we start the review, because I agree, Marcella, what you're saying, but
that's my question, right?
Yeah,
if it's already considered or maybe not in the, yeah.
Well, I asked the students to focus on one single, one technology and one problem, because you know, in a studio, otherwise, if they look at everything at the same time, I think that then it becomes very difficult to be specific. And I think in the studios, I usually try to narrow down as much as possible to follow a scientific method. But it's true. I think in relationship to your question, Farah has been focusing on the relation between the subway and the elevator as a mobility problem, and pedestrians, but then the pedestrian was kind of left behind.
On the ground.
No, pedestrian at the ground level.
At the ground level.
Yeah, so it's underground subway, pedestrian at the ground level, and then elevator. But before proceeding, I just want Farah to finish do you have, Farah, the elevators?
I asked because before we start the discussion, in case we have missed anything.
Yeah, also for the other students, just make sure that you have everything in the PowerPoint, and then you go through the middle, because you are missing some presentations. Do you have the cameras of the elevators? Not that one. The ones that we discussed last week.
No.
No? Okay, all right. So what would be the elevator movement? We don't have it, but you had it in the software, no? Or no? Well, anyways, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
yeah.
So if I may jump in, because first of all, I really like your scientific approach to be very precise. If you want to cut deep, you need to be very sharp, and I like that. It's not all over the place. It's just comparing two things. I think, Farah, you have an amazing intuition. I really like, in regard to my own research, where looking at the relationship between the virtually constructed world, the visually constructed world, and the physically constructed world. I mean, here you are juxtaposing two things: a kind of physical world of the body in space, in crowded subway car and physical infrastructure, versus the visual or virtual presence of the city through all those kind of image building that exist as a method of investment, as you have been talking about, but kind of almost a visual presence. A lot of people, if you go around the world, people would have an image of New York. They haven't necessarily been in New York, but they can tell you, oh, New York looks like this or exists like that. And a lot of development from Dubai to Hong Kong to New York are based on this kind of visual or virtual presence. So I think looking at this non-correlation or somewhat correlation between the visual world and the physical world is really interesting. I just feel like you have that intuition at the beginning, and as you develop your project, you get a little bit lost with all your tools and all your representation technique. It was striking to me that at the end you were not even commenting your project, which is showing us image, but you have to be careful. The visual world of computation, of representation, is also kind of problematic. And I don't think your app should necessarily be an end product as far as I'm concerned. I think your research to me is more kind of a criticism of the disjunction between, let's say, what we call the real world, which to me is an overlap of visual, virtual, and physical world. But where do you find, and I was happy you were on this kind of yellow and black diagram, where do you have maximum dissociation between the virtual world and the physical world? At the end of the day, all those workers who are coming, all the people who are coming, yeah, this has interesting potential to me. A lot of those people who are coming, commuting to Times Square and so on, basically, they don't really count. They are being paid like $7.25 an hour to clean up those towers, to be, you know, maids or doormen or whatever, who are not really valued in our system. You know, the vast majority of the population do not live in those pencil towers. In fact, most of those big visual presence towers are empty. So in many ways, what you're doing could also be a very interesting social criticism of our society between the kind of visual, virtual value of how you have to exist, represent yourself in the almost non-physical world, which is also associated where that money is being made through all those stock market and valuation of derivative, which are also dissociated from physical condition. So I think you have this intuition of almost this physical infrastructure versus a virtual infrastructure. When I talk about virtual infrastructure, is how much the city or those developers are advertising. I mean, the city of New York is spending millions of dollars advertising on its image, which usually doesn't talk about its subway or barely about its people, but more about its skyline. So lots of good intuition, but the development is like, oh, how do I represent this almost social contradiction between, let's say, the physical infrastructure and the what I would call the virtual/visual infrastructure. So I feel like there's tremendous potential, and I'm a little bit frustrated because at the end I'm not sure what you're trying to.
Yeah, actually, I agree, Fred, with the comment. Is Farah, if you can make the effort of this is for the students, to follow the conversation in relationship to the drawings. Right now, we have half of the screen that is empty. So I don't understand, you know, when Fred is mentioning certain issues, it would be good to follow the conversation in relationship to the drawings. Can you put the animation of how would you think you would experience the subway of New York in relationship to what Fred is saying? Because that's the thesis of the project. The thesis is to give a different experience of New York for the generic of the population that usually don't get to be up in the sky, right? That's the equity here, right? Can you show the animation, Farah, of the subway?
You want to correlate them, or do you want, or is it structured that it's as dissociated as possible?
Well, I think that Farah is trying to create some kind of conflict between the lack of equity, right, in terms of experience of the city. And that's the interesting combination between form follow function and New York, right? That the Lidius New York is kind of you know, not looking at that problem, right? It's not looking at the mass, and form follow function is trying to make an argument that the city follows finance, right? And that Farah is trying to do something in relationship to that. But Farah, can you show the animation that I'm talking about, the one that you showed?
One quick last comment. I know I already took a lot of time, but I think there are some visual data set about where tourists are tweeting or sending their image, and where residents are also sending image of New York. How New York exists visually in, I think Sarah Williams had published some maps in blue.
Actually, we were the first ones to do that. We retrieved the Instagram back in 2015 and 2017. We retrieved all the Instagram posts when the API was open. Now it's not possible to do that anymore because they close all the media, social media. They close their API, some of them. but we were able to do a mapping of the tourist area relative to where they were taking the pictures of. So that's a very interesting. And we did a 3D scanning of New York from the social media post at the Cooper Union. So yeah, that's an interesting problem, by the way. It would be, that's a different project if you want, right?
But what I'm saying is that a lot of those, I mean, and you find that through history, where, you know, the center of power usually needs to have a champ de Mars or a open space in front, so you could see the town hall or you could see the cathedral. It need to exist visually and virtually in that sense, as a myth almost, the same way that all those super tall tower that represent maybe the new tower needs to be next to Central Park so you can actually take a picture of it. It's impossible to take a good picture of the Empire State Building from the ground. You need to be in Brooklyn or in Central Park, or, you know, so maybe looking at the visual field of the production of the image, which generates the production of those buildings, in opposition to the subway access, let's say.
I also use this opportunity to say that Sandra Manninger has also joined our reviews. Thank you, Sandra, for coming. But Fred, yeah, I totally agree. Yes, thank you for coming. Sandra is also involved in a parallel course. So thank you, Sandra, for joining. Fred, so recovering your conversation, I absolutely agree. I wish it would be more clear, Farah presentation, because Farah worked a lot. And it was more precise than the way that if I were you, I would not know what to say, because it's very difficult to follow the project. But Farah did a quite interesting work in being precise about each step. It's just the way that Farah, you present is very difficult to follow and to actually see where you're trying to go. But I think that the last animations are a little more clear. I just wish that you had more of that. But Marcella, in relationship to what you're saying, what would be, you know, like you were talking about mobility, and this touches upon mobility, right? What Farah is trying to do, just to clarify, is to relate mobility in relationship to the subway and in relationship to the disjunction in terms of equity, because of what Fred was saying, right? About people working every day 9 to 5, living and not seeing the city, right?
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm just thinking, you know, about maybe next step or further development. I'm also interested in seeing where actually this extreme of this association might be in the city. I think there are moments, probably, Farah, where the data sets start to give you extremes conditions, right? That start to disassociate what's above and what's below. And perhaps these are moments within which we start to embody much more this, again, this disjunction, and how through the project you try to reconciliate again these two conditions. Because to me, that's, you know, very interesting. Again, the way in which the project is set up as a narrative related to experience of New York, from being able to give access and frame to the lack of equity of experience of the city. I'm wondering where are maybe in your work, in the data sets that you looked, where are these extreme moments of extreme conditions within the urban fabric, which it seems to me that that's what these maps start to do.
Yes, so in my opinion, even though the bigger dots are more density of people, and even though there are more people along the and the clusters are the density of high rise, but my explanation was, even though there are more people and more high rise, but the dissociation is there.
Is higher.
Is higher.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you were trying to do with the machine learning prediction model, right? That is difficult to follow because you explain it like in 2 words, and it's difficult to follow. So I don't know if you want to.
But I'm not sure you should have view from axonometric above view, but also view from the ground, also like
at the pedestrian level. Yeah.
What is a visual field from Central Park or from, I don't know, across the river? I think there's a visual scape or a virtual and visual scape that you are lacking in the data.
So you're saying, Fred, you're saying the normal. What is the normal condition of the person moving in the street? And then
no, not at all.
Okay.
I mean, if we learn from Dubai, where you know the image becomes a main finance for the project, I think it would be really interesting. I mean, obviously, let's say you're a developer and you're trying to develop a new tower in New York. You might want, a few years ago, you might want to be next to a subway exit, so you could be close to where people can access. But I would say that today, you need to exist in the visual scape, you need to exist in the virtual scape. So which piece of land would be really positive so people can take a picture of it? It could exist in the advertisement world, it could exist, you know, as an icon, even if it's not close to any subway, but it would have, you know, a visual presence or exist in the visual/virtual world. And that, to me, would be really interesting to start mapping the value, let's say, of the landscape based on visual accessibility rather than physical accessibility.
Yeah, that's one of the points. The question is, but you're taking the side of the developer, right? Which is fair. I don't mind.
No, I'm saying just giving value. I mean, if those value are,
but it's interesting. I think what you're proposing is that the Farah's idea or Farah's app could actually work both ways, right? That you could produce an imaginary, right? That's what you're building up, a symbolic form or different type of symbolic form of the city.
Well, her idea of reconciling is very noble and good, but I don't know if that's the best way to work. I might just look at the gaps. I might just look at the discrepancy as kind of explaining more what's happening, because the change might not be through illustrations, the change might be through policy and things like that. But so I'm not sure.
I could jump in. I think it's a solid body of technical work, Farah. There's some, you've acquired really great skills to bring forward to your further courses in the program, and I think it's a great start. I'm also caught between looking at your observations or its animate diagrammatics through various kinds of computational tools and media, which is somewhere between a set of observations and conclusions about our experience of the city and disciplinary formulations of the city, as you have as references, and caught between those observations and a set of projections of design of outcomes that come out of these processes. And maybe that's too early, I'm not sure. Having seen your work at both the third review and midterm review, I had expectations that there would be a set of formulations of the relationship between subways, elevators, and potentially a prototype for a new kind of mobility, whether that's lateral systems. I was looking at notes I was taking from your midterm, and I was anticipating that there would be a set of lateral or diagonal network connectivities that could begin to take shape in the city in the ways that you're form finding them. That's not particularly what you've done, but I think that there are instances where the scale of investigation could begin to understand the relationship between this underground world, which is all very horizontal, and the connection to those vertical instances, which, to speak the language of development, that would be in effect a transport-oriented development where the elevators of a complex are deeply connected to the infrastructures of the city. In the case of New York, that would have to be the subway. But that's not particularly what you've done. And I'm not sure whether to formulate this as a question or just continue with my observations. But the activation of these systems and what they might engender, what they could project towards alternatives. I'm not sure why else one would be doing all this body of work and working with these kind of data sets of mobility systems. So, you know, I think that there are other formulations of the city or projections that haven't been built. You know, William Corbett's multi-layered city of from the 1920s, sky lobby typologies over the last decade or two, which begin to set up networks in the city at much higher level, and relationships between various kinds of elevators and massing at levels way at a kind of elevation way above the ground. But that's not necessarily the outcome of the work. So I just ask maybe what the potential is to engage with other paradigms or radical projects of network connectivity well above the ground. There are beyond, you know, Corbett and Fritz Lang and other sorts of early 20th century moments or models or instances of visions of future connectivity and high density. But there's also, you know, Ville Spatiale by Friedman, New Babylon, a number of network formulations of architecture far more obsessed with the lateral spread and growth of the city laterally than vertically. And I'm wondering where you stand in relation to those potentials, because it seems the project seems quite pregnant with those possibilities, yet you defer from making those sorts of formulations of compounding these two existing systems with any potential new or other system that may generate relationships across the city beyond the vertical and the underground horizontal. Forgive me if that's a very long question.
So you're asking if I could formulate a new type of typology of the city or the urban fabric?
Yes, I mean, that seems to be the potential in the project, and whether you can either speculate on those possibilities or see or make a statement about how the tools that you've developed could be applied towards that, the formulation of a prototype that might surpass the discreteness of elevators connected to the as discrete buildings connected to the subway.
So because this is like a VR application, maybe in the navigation, maybe instead of navigating through the existing lines or the existing structure, I could think of navigation in a different, like from a different perspective, and not the existing navigation routes.
I think that Tom is asking a different thing, and I'm glad, Tom, that this issue comes up, because to me, why are we doing what we're doing in this studio, right? Like, why are we identifying, tracing, reading, surveying information flows? And the idea is that the application would not only be depicting an existing condition, but the form of the application would actually change the real time how people move in the city. And that's, to me, the key of Google, right? Google understands that very clearly, right? And I call that the architecture of information, right? Which is that by identifying an information flow and mediating that information flow, you actually have more impact in reality than by creating a building or by creating an urban project. And that's the kind of scary side of Google that is doing much more architecture, at least to me, than any other architect, right? And I think that, Tom, you're hitting upon that. To me, the problem is a data science versus computer science problem, which is, would you, and I think that, I thank you for elevating the level of the conversation, because the issue is, at what point is it necessary today to propose a new form of mobility, or just simply by mediating that form of mobility, that would actually happen on its own through an evolutive feedback system, by how people use it. I don't think that is any longer necessary to think in a kind of anticipatory way in architecture, rather than thinking about real-time feedback between a predictive model and how that predictive model is being used and how one feeds back that predictive model, rather than establishing a kind of visionary architecture about how could that happen. I think that the lessons of data science is that we should stop earlier and let the resonance or the feedback take life of its own.
Maybe I want to jump in here, Pablo. I think I would not agree with you. I would say questions of data science and computer science in terms of driving changes in mobility is maybe not necessarily what I think is the outcome of the current project we're discussing here right now. Because as you said in the beginning, you ask the student to look at one problem only, which I would also think is how to say it, reduced look at a large set of patterns that one could actually recall or reclaim through that research, right? I think for me, it's important that we educate students in a way to critically look at data sets and become managers of complexity, which is really the nature of our own education, because we are able to actually correlate data or actually data points from complete, initially maybe unrelated sets of information and actually drive new insight. It's very unique to the designer, the architect, and the creative person out of the design domains, which we not always see, let's say, from engineers that have actually a very linear approach, right? That's our strength. That's our strength, and that's our asset. And if I could finish, maybe, Pablo. Yeah. So I think from that point of view, I also want to say mobility, looking just from one point of view, which is just a pure pedestrian movement, is actually, in that sense, almost, how to say, inefficient. Because if we look back, and I'm sure, maybe, I'm not sure when Tom Verebes arrived in London, but Space Syntax almost 3 decades ago has started looking at data sets in urban movement, which was the beginning of looking actually at mobility, right? In very complex forms that has informed, and afterwards, in the decades later, Office of Sorts of Fast and Rogers in making not only a complete understanding of human behavior in public space, but also traffic. This is what Marcella actually related to, right? A more broader picture of traffic that then actually starts to inform decision-making in real estate, and all the financial and all of that comes afterwards. So we have that already. There's a long history of that. And I think it just hasn't been maybe used in other creative ways, but I think the methodologies are out there. But I want to actually move back and away from that and say, the important thing here maybe is, in the current project, looking at very simple items, right? One is subway, one is skyline. Okay, so now what can we do as architects about that? So then we move forward and look at density of subway entry points and positions and versus density of inhabitants. And she said, so how can people movement change the shape of a city? And I think she maybe how to say, unintentionally posed a pretty interesting question that is often maybe neglected in design, right? And how can that inform the shape of a city? That's actually really, I think, exciting, because we're all about space. We are not so much mobility designers. We are more space designers, right? In that sense, I think the relationship of this physical movement versus the virtual presence is an interesting one. And so we start to look into the correlation of data, right? Again, that's really the exciting part here, really. So different data sets that allow us to do insights in possible projective predictions, and I would call it maybe even development rights or space stock as I defined it in the recent paper I wrote for the Biennale this year, where I was very excited about the fact of Zuboff's article on behavior of humans and the impact actually on financial processes, right? So, because it brings us to the point where we are really dealing, and I think we at NYT, we had a lecture on that, right? Markets for future behavior, right? So this is where this kind of virtuality comes in. The markets for future behavior are the ones based on prediction products. That does not exist in architecture yet. Yeah. And so this underlying smartness, I would say, of quantitative data and qualitative data, right, that we are trying to correlate here, is actually interesting, because it seems to me that what the student is trying to do could bring us to what I thought is for me a problem that I'm trying to look into is this kind of idea of the New York development air rights, right? That has been put forward around, I think, 1964, where at the same time Dennis Crumpton in England has speculated also about new ways of organizing space through some kind of virtual computational modeling. There's an interesting correlation that was at the time. And now the question is, so how can we do that with the interesting opportunity today of having more data set available, right? So what does air right mean actually in the near future, when we can suddenly start to swap virtual airspace between construction plots? Yeah, we create new types of stock market exchanges, right? And then comes all this kind of rabbit tail, you say, office buildings, non-existing office buildings, abandoned office spaces and all of that, right, that we have in New York. And now you get the correlation actually with data on the ground and below the ground. And then you get a lot of set of opportunities, I would say, that bring us into a situation where it's no more about master planning as a land value creation, right? But it is actually a kind of a master planning as a virtual value creation. And then you can start to build a connection then to Amazon and Google, etc., that they're creating us what we call the virtual halo effect, right? I'm sure you all know what that means. Yeah. So then I was saying, so what is then how that maps then into space, in space planning? I think that's for me much more important than actually talking about here issues of mobility, etc., which we have already in some way resolved many years ago. It's just now the question, how does it actually inform space in complete new ways?
Well, Christian, I think that you're describing the platform that I've been working on for the last 10 years. With the platform that we're working on is a correlational information-based platform that is supposed to work globally, identifying the growth of cities in relationship to multiple dynamic data sets. And I actually published many articles about it. And but the issue here in relationship to correlation or not, I of course agree on data correlation. The problem is in the scope of one semester, right? With students starting and addressing a scientific data evidence-based method, how do you address correlation is actually very difficult. Actually, I named the lecture series Correlational Crisis, right? Because identifying what you're saying, that scientists actually look in particular problems, and we have the opportunity to actually integrate and be critical of different correlational models. The problem is, and that's the reason why in the studios, I ask students to actually focus on one or two layers. In this case, there are two different problems that are trying to be correlated. Not many, because if they do everything at once, then they lose track of the relationship between the data acquisition problem and how that data can be actually manipulated. So while I agree with you about the correlational model, the question is how do you activate that to both learns, because it's a problem of learning and activating a design problem. And in the scope of a studio, at least from my experience in teaching computation, the relationship between the history of computation and the history of urban and information systems is actually a correlational model. So I'm trying to take the students through the history of computation, through different technologies, until they address, if you want, a problem of correlation. But in this case, I think that Farah's model is addressing a problem of correlation. It's not as broad as you would like it to be. And of course, the broader, the better. But I don't think in the scope of a study of one semester, one will be able to do that.
I might just jump in and thank you for the wonderful presentation, great comments. It's really very, very interesting presentation. I agree also because at this moment we're just looking at one of the charts of the data charts that came out of the machine learning progress. And I agree with Pablo that you have to test the system first before you apply it on a broader data set. So what you do as a data scientist would be just to generate synthetic data, or probably in this case, just take a limited set of data points and then check if you're addressing the right problem. And I think Farah did a very well job, because she went from this simple linear regression model, probably more complicated. But she already knows half a year after having been introduced to these machine learning systems that she would need another model. That's something that usually a data scientist does. So really a great job that you were able to produce kind of how within the studio. In relation to that, I'm also very interested in, I think, Farah, you are just avoiding probably a problem that is very architectural instead of aesthetics, something I've never heard in any of the conversations yet, though I think you still think it is a problem of aesthetics, because I think the people are working in these environments, they're probably the mates. They are actually probably within those towers, they have access to this private atmosphere, but in a different environment. So do you still think that the aesthetic value differentiates subway versus the high-riser, the horizontal versus the vertical movement?
I'm not suggesting that the skyline is about aesthetics, or the image. It's already an image that has been created in our minds for so long, and it has been driven because of finance. And so, like, how would I be able to break that? It's not from the point of view of desire, or not a desire, but how could I bring down the skyline?
So I think you will not be able to probably answer your questions if you really considerably excluding aesthetic values, because they are political. They are super political. To decorate something was something that was done from the Baroque. I think there was sort of a convent in Trient where they started to use the Baroque style as a style to represent the Catholic Church, the splendor, everything grand. So I think that's a continuation that is longer within the architectural production than just when it started to become horizontally stacked. Yeah. So I think those qualities have to be incorporated into your design. And I think that's something that you have to accept, that aesthetic is a political decision. It's not just a designer's decision or preference.
With that note, we need to move on to the next project, because otherwise we can continue. I like a lot the Sandra's your intervention in relationship to Christian's also point on the difference between quantitative data and qualitative. How do we intervene qualitatively, right, in relationship to data sets? And I think that maybe perhaps this project starts addressing that, because Sandra, I totally agree. the decisions that we are actually activating may also have to do with what you're saying. But perhaps in this project, maybe not in the next one, but in the following one, we may be able to address more that issue. But if you don't mind, unless somebody wants to say something in relationship to this project, we would go to the next one. Does anybody has any short comment, perhaps, or any feedback? No? All right. Okay. So thank you for the reviewers. Thank you, Farah. And now we go with we start with Kavya. Kavya, if you can start your presentation. We're running a little late. We're supposed to be looking in 10 minutes to the next project, but Kavya, if you can be short and brief, and we have the discussion, and we're going to have some other reviewers joining in, and we may lose some reviewers because I know, Marcella, you have to go. So don't worry about leaving because I know that you have a plane to
I have to catch a plane.
Yeah, exactly. So then don't worry about it. If you can, the rest of the reviewers, if you can stay a little longer, it would be great, and we transition with the other ones as well. And we also are joined by Nelson Montas. Thank you, Nelson, for joining us. Kavya, go ahead.
Yes, Professor. Good morning, everyone. My project is based at the Rockefeller Center, including the cathedral, St. Patrick Cathedral, and I would be dealing with the I'm basically analyzing the pedestrian flow, how they move around, and how to utilize the public space more effectively. So in that process, I went through the photogrammetry, that is the point cloud analyzation. From there, I took it to instance and instance segmentation. That's the process how I went through. This is the documentation, basically how I did the Rockefeller Center through the point clouds and the interiors of the St. Patrick Cathedral. The Rockefeller Center is basically a center that integrates the vertical city with the horizontal one, and with its pedestrian circulation around the plaza to the centers. I mean, it links the pedestrian circulation above ground to the underground concourse levels. That's what I'll be dealing with. This is again the documentation, I mean, how of the point cloud of the Rockefeller lobbies, the cross section. And in that process, I tried to play with the Conway's game of life for the Rockefeller lobbies, and I projected them in 5 generations. This is the first, like this is the lobby area, that is the thickness would keep increasing from, this is the less thickness to the medium thickness to the max thickness, which I could increase. And these are the lobby centers, which would be connecting the concourse and the pedestrian regions, like these. The entire Rockefeller Center. So the pedestrian concourse levels to the above level, the ground level. And from here, why I did the photogrammetry is I wanted to find a solution to segment the complete site via object tracking and OpenCV. Like the object tracking the first steps which I initialized couldn't track the humans, but it tracked the cars. And later on, I framed it in a manner that it could, like these, this is masking out the maroon ones are the people moving in the Rockefeller rink, the skating rink. It colorized the backgrounds, basically. This is the segmentation. And this is the final product, the tracking of the humans in relation. I mean, this is just from the live data set of the one which I could find, but this will be in real time. I'll be applying it over the entire Rockefeller Center. I mean, it's you could see this. It's detecting as windows, so it shouldn't. And using this process, I use the segmentation in the Rockefeller Center. Like you could see the concourse level being in the blue color, and the above this is basically the roof section, the orange, and the walls being the yellowish green. And this is basically I wanted to create an app using the object detection and the segmentation for the for utilizing the public space more effectively via the pedestrian movements. And that's it. Thank you.
I don't know if it is clear for the reviewers, but we basically ran out of time, and Kavya is exploring different technologies with machine learning and image segmentation. And Kavya, if you can summarize, what are you planning to do with that? Well, because it's not there yet, right? But what's the objective?
The objective is to detect the pedestrian movements to basically utilize the problem is the public space as the Rockefeller Center is not being utilized properly. Like could you see, it is crowded at certain points, like the skating ring is completely crowded. Whereas again, at the shopping areas where you have the sit outs, it's least crowded. So I want to create an app wherein you could actually tell people you could move around and utilize the space properly to convey the message that this is the skating ring isn't the main attraction. You have other attractions also. Like for example, I'm an international student. The first thing which caught my eye is the skating ring. I did not know where to. I couldn't maneuver properly. So the main objective is to utilize this public space properly.
But the first thing of your app would be to identify the areas where the public space is mostly used and to intervene in relationship to that, correct?
Yes. And okay. For that, I'll be using three crowd mapping processes. One is the instance, then the normal segmentation, followed by the 3D. And the next step in the future step would be the heat mapping, wherein I would be segmenting the spaces.
So just to reframe, perhaps you don't tell people what to do, but you do a mapping of where that movement happens, and then there is a project in relationship to that.
Yes, I'm still working on that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Kavya, I think that brings up my first question. That would be, what do you think is effective use of space?
Professor, when I just chose this site, I'd been there. It started raining, and I did not know like where to go. So what I want to design is in relation, with the live cam, the live feed, and the weather forecast, you could actually tell, like if you're the person using the app, you could actually say that you could probably, instead of the skating ring, you could move somewhere here, like where the shades are. You could just take the direction. It's basically it's directing you to move.
That I'm not sure if I like that, because it's very prescriptive, right? If you tell people what to do.
No, you can give some options to them, and they could just accordingly could move around.
But I think it is more fair to say that you are creating a zoning of use, of actual use, so that perhaps other stakeholders, the city of New York, or even the Rockefeller Center Incorporated, which is like could actually think about how to better address the space in relationship to your mapping. I imagine that your interface is just simply informing what's going on for the moment.
Exactly. I think it's a very good and precise learning element for city planners, for example. Usually as a landscape designer, for example, you would design some pathways. And nowadays it has totally changed. What landscape designers would tell you, we just like let people walk around the area and then follow the path of the people to then just make this new path, right? So I think in that sense, I think your tool could be very, very useful in learning about how do people like to agglomerate and where do they want to stay, giving a specific weather condition. Where do they go then? You know, when it's raining, the ice rink would probably be empty. But other than that, it's a very good attract. Of course, it's the main attraction point. So why would people gathering there? Because you want to look at the ice rink, you want to see the ice skaters go there, or you want to go and see the large Christmas tree. So I think that's a very good informational tool that could work in real time.
Yeah, as a follow-up, I will question why the Rockefeller Center. So I don't know if this is something that was given. So why specifically Rockefeller Center? I think if we start to look at the relationship between ownership and public space, I think the city, this project perhaps might start to open up different type of potentials. So I think Rockefeller Center and actually the space, it probably is the less desirable maybe for the research that you're trying to do, because it's a privately owned public space. And if we think about this as a potential to begin to give some type of feedback in terms of use of public space in the city, I will begin to see how perhaps different type of public spaces that are perhaps not privately owned or are partially privately owned will start to begin to trigger different type of dynamics. So to me, they actually looking at Rockefeller Center as a very, highly privately owned, interest-driven public space is almost the opposite of what you're trying to do. And again, and also it's also event-based right now, right? So the rink only exists for how long? For 2-3 months a year. So I'm wondering how do your project start to set up different type of parameters that look at the starting from a taxonomy of public spaces that look at the relationship between public and private, and control, issues of control of public space, which I think that's quite key, talking about use and dynamics over time. And so all of these layers to me are missing right now. And I think have a pretty strong potential in being embedded into the project, really add other layers that right now we don't see, I think. Because I think the tracking, it's not really doing anything. The tracking, it really talks about time and density, but I'm not sure it really talks about the detection about, yes, pedestrian movement, but also is a very specific and more event-based. So actually, I think that, yeah.
No, Marcella, yeah, I agree, because I actually been trying, I didn't want students to, for me to give them the site. They actually not only chose, but the idea was to actually develop the site, not to have a cookie cutter, okay, this is Rockefeller Center, and then that's the problem. And I've been trying to take Kavya away from that, but at the same time, I'm not sure. I also kind of agree and disagree at the same time, because the relation between private and public in New York is extremely problematic. It's all the way from the zoning, right? And in the case of Rockefeller Center, it's one of the best ones historically in relationship to what you're saying, like Rockefeller Center, the Met, and so on. So in that sense, it's actually a highly valuable public asset in the good relationship between private ownership and public space. Is one of the few ones that I defend, because I'm very critical about the zoning of New York. But in this case, it's not so problematic. But I agree with you that the cutting of the space is the issue, right? That the morphology of the urban space could actually be expanded, not to be identified by only the private ownership of that area. So
but I'm wondering, perhaps looking around the Rockefeller Center, if that's the area, there are many other public spaces that talk about this balance between public and private. Yeah. And so I'm wondering how the fabric could start to expand within the type of, within the research specifically.
And in relationship to the survey, because this particular project
the survey
is a survey.
Specifically.
Exactly,
yes,
it's a survey
issue.
Yes. So the
Yeah.
boundaries, I asked Kavya to look at the boundaries, right? Like where that happens and the transition, the thresholds.
Yeah,
And,
that's exactly my point. The type
yeah.
of boundaries, because when you start, the boundaries are already critical to set up the parameters that you're going to look at it.
Just in general, we have new reviewers joining us. Just I ask you to be patient. We're finishing a review from the previous term, so I'll introduce everybody after we are done with this project and we start the following review. Yeah, Tom, you want to say something?
Yeah, just to pick up this discussion of public and private, I think that Rockefeller Center is, I think it's a great example of New York's public spaces as making them very public. But I think it's also an 85-year-old project. That doesn't make it in any way not relevant. But I also think that in order to be projective, one has to be a little bit more critical about the spaces. It seems that you like the space, Kavya, and the project itself, rather than having a critique that potentially can see this as, at least as an academic exercise, a potential transformation of this complex. And so that the acquisition of technical skills and expertise seems to stop before making either statements, diagrams, transformations, or generative outcomes that would begin to project this kind of relationship between public and private space. Now, I don't think that you've got to a point where you have necessarily a projection of how the transformation of this space. And I think that that's maybe the goal of the exercise. I would think of this design studio is to see the ways in which you could intervene. And I think that some of the interventions that one can see today compared to maybe several years ago, either pre 9/11 or pre-Donald Trump down the road in Trump Tower, where the concrete big blocks saying NYPD arrived, which changed where you can flow and where you can move. And although I think diagrammatically this underground space of the concourse level is potentially fantastic, and every time I walk down there I think, wow, this could be amazing, but oh, isn't it absolutely awful and horrible? Mainly because it's underactivated, it's not used, it doesn't have enough program, it doesn't have enough activity or people or even connection to the above of light. And of my own critiques, let's say, that I'm sharing of Rockefeller Center, I think there is great potential to transform the space. And within the context of your studio, I think you could have more bold assertions as to how one can transform the context within which you're working, so that it's really not just a site for survey and for study of that survey and for the exercises that you're developing these skills with, but for actually beginning to generate new possibilities for various kinds of uses for public space, relations and connections between these different networks of the concourse level and the network of public spaces on the ground level. And I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, Pablo, but I think that is the goal of these exercises, is to surpass the survey as a set of observations computationally, to begin to generate potential transformations of that particular context, as big or small as that context is. In this case, it's limited to Rockefeller Center.
No, absolutely. Actually, in this case, yes. In this case, there was a double objective, because in a way, each student developed a little bit like their own thesis in relationship to the objectives of the studios, because we have very few students. And one of the objective, actually, I asked Kavya exactly to do that, because the underground concourse level is dead, right, in the Rockefeller Center. And the previous kind of streamlined idea of interrelating the subway with the ground level did not really work. And that's why Kavya was showing these surfaces that were trying to break the ground and identify where to break the ground in relationship to the concourse level. I was imagining, like my type of preference was a topological kind of continuity between ground level and underground level, and even the lobby, and even all the way to the terraces, in which one could identify where that can happen out of the object tracking recognition and the semantic segmentation that Kavya did. So in Kavya's case, the survey could have actually identified moments in which one could actually develop that. But just, sorry, Fred, before finishing, but at the same time, the app itself could actually open up that question without actually having to intervene. And that's, to me, one of the objectives of this studio that perhaps we're going to see in the next project. Yeah, Fred, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, you know, as much as it's really futuristic, avant-garde, looking at data set, I think you should not underestimate the resistance of the architecture, the traditional architecture. And, you know, again, I would use this data set as a new way to infuse the physical context, or how the event context and the physical context are battling for appropriation of that space. And what I'm a little bit missing is to see how this new energy, this new system of organization could modify, could break, could transform temporarily or permanently the physical context. But to do that, you need to look at what are the means, what are the capacity of the physical context to resist, to accept, to where is the physical context soft enough that it can be invaded. And, you know, I think it's very interesting what you're looking at, and it's very real what you're looking at also. This notion of event space that I think Bernard Tschumi started really writing and talking about, and lots of other people. But today, no events. I mean, today space is being used very much on events. I mean, from rave party to anything where you radically transform the usage of the space through the possibility of new telecommunication, where you don't care if you put a post on Facebook or Instagram or anything that you want, but then you transform through kind of digital information infrastructure the capacity of the environment to be activated.
Well, exactly.
So the question is, how does that new set of data influence, permeate, transform, activate, and what are the places that are receptive to this kind of transformation? What are the places of resistance of this? And that could be made a little bit more instructive rather than having kind of a homogeneous data set placed on that.
No, I agree. I agree. The question is in relationship to the current revolution of data science, if one should prescribe that or not. I will have as an architect, I will have the temptation to actually propose it, how that will happen. But I would like to, at least in this studio, to open that up to a kind of feedback evolutionary process in which we do not determine that question. But before, sorry, Nelson, I know you want to say something, but we have new reviewers and we need to change. We need to keep advancing. We're going to start with Salma's project, but I'm sure that if Nelson, if you can stay, we're going to whatever question you have, we can retrieve it later. But thanks everybody for your comments. We have
Pablo,
yes,
one thing, just for this student. You should look at SX Market currently, which is a brand new development, which has like 4 or 5 blocks connected by an underground system that wants to be above ground, underground, activating the street, activating the underground, and use that as extra FAR development. So it's kind of a contemporary condition under construction right now of that type of partially above and below ground system.
All right. Thank you, Fred. Okay. Thank you, Kavya. Thank you, Fred, for the comments. Thank you, the reviewers.